based upon the artificial realities of time. They operate on the accomplishment of tasks. And as we, again, previously spoke, it was clear come September to the Russian authority, it was clear to me earlier that they had insufficient resources to accomplish the task. They are now in the process of accumulating those resources. And once they do that, they're going to finish the mission. That mission is demilitarization, denazification, destruction of the Ukrainian military, the elimination of the Zelensky regime, and pretty much the elimination of Ukraine as a modern nation state. I'm not gloating over this. It's not an outcome that I prefer, but as a professional intelligence analyst, if I were briefing the President of the United States on down, this would be the conclusion I would give them, and I would be able to articulate exactly why this is going to happen. But the Russians have said that they will accomplish all of their stated objectives. Nothing has changed. One of their objectives is denazification, and President Putin, in his most recent speech announcing the mobilization, called the Zelensky government a Nazi regime. And I'm a simple Marine. Math isn't my forte, but 2 + 2 = 4. If you call the Zelensky government a Nazi regime and your policy is denazification, that means mission is not accomplished. There's a Holocaust against the Russians. There's a genocide against the Russians. The genocide's been ongoing since 2014, when the Ukrainian government forcefully evicted Viktor Yanukovych, the legally elected president of Ukraine, replaced him with a government that was dominated by right-wing people who embraced the ideology of Stepan Bandera, a Ukrainian nationalist who fought alongside Adolf Hitler in World War II, who killed tens of thousands of Jews, slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Russians and Ukrainian Poles. They passed laws banning Russian language, banning Russian culture, basically banning Russia. If you replace the term Russia from the existing Ukrainian laws and inserted Jew, you would have the same legal foundation as Nazi Germany in the 1930s. No, it's not a rational conclusion. The rational conclusion is that Russia had insufficient resources for the task. You can't have a 1,000-kilometer front manned by 30 to 60 men per kilometer, in some cases 15 men per kilometer. Russia didn't have enough men to accomplish the task, especially when NATO and the United States infused Ukraine with tens of billions of dollars of equipment, provided training, etc., allowing the Ukrainian military, which Russia largely destroyed over the course of the summer, to be reconstituted in a more modern, more capable form. But the Ukrainians have burned out their reserves. In the recent fighting, the Russian casualties probably number in the high hundreds. The Ukrainian casualties, according to Ukraine themselves, 20 to 50,000 dead and wounded. So how you turn this into a Russian defeat is beyond me. Yeah, it's a proxy conflict. I mean, the one thing that's lacking is direct NATO American boots on the ground with American, well, there are guys wearing American flags, but officially wearing the American uniform, fighting for the United States. But the bottom line is the army that Ukraine is wielding today is a NATO army. It's not a Ukrainian army. It's organized, trained, equipped by NATO. It receives instructions from NATO. It receives intelligence from NATO. The logistics are provided by NATO. It's a NATO military. I've been saying that the U.S. Special Forces have been in country since April, and I'm correct. Now the news is caught up, and they're saying, yes, there's a presidential finding that's done that. We pulled out the CIA and we pulled out Special Forces in February when the invasion took place. And in March, they were still not there. But once the decision was made to supply this materiel, U.S. Special Forces returned for 2 functions. One, to facilitate the covert routes that would be taken. I mean, there's a reason why Russia is not blowing all this stuff up at the border when it comes over. That's because the United States has carried out a concerted effort to break these things down into packages, get them across the border, assemble them covertly in warehouses, get them forward deployed to the units necessary. This is being done by United States Special Forces. They're also responsible for overseeing the integration of this equipment, communications, and the intelligence with the Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainian forces are using these iPads at Special Forces. It's a technique developed in Iraq and then later on in Syria, where we provided these iPads capable of secure communications to forward deployed Iraqi forces and Syrian forces so they could receive direct intelligence feed and communicate back to their Special Forces handlers. So their Special Forces teams in Ukraine who are communicating directly with Ukrainian commanders on the front, sharing intelligence and tactical advice with them in real time. I would hope they're not, but I don't know. Generally speaking, they don't. Generally speaking, even when Joint Special Operations goes in a situation like this, they'll be wearing civilian clothes, operating under some sort of cover, whether it be a contractor or some foreign cover. The Russians know this, and the Russians are actively targeting it. We don't know that we haven't suffered casualties. Generally speaking, in covert operations like this, when Americans die, it's reported as a training accident, or somehow it's hushed. We don't just acknowledge that an American died in Ukraine in a covert operation. So who knows, if we've lost anybody? Who knows if the Russians are deliberately avoiding targeting Americans out of concern of escalating this conflict? I don't know, but what I can say with near certainty is that Americans are on the ground operating in the manner that I've articulated to you. Russia knows about it, and Russia's factoring this into their response. I believe that the Russian response is this: there's no need to kill an American operating 50 miles behind the front lines, when all we have to do is destroy the Ukrainian forces, Ukrainian/NATO forces that are in front of us. That's where we get victory. We don't get victory by killing an American. We get victory by destroying the Ukrainian military. And I think the Russian focus is on that, not on scoring some political points by killing a JSOC or a CIA person somewhere in Ukraine. We don't know. Generally, something like this would be handed to, on a scope and scale of this, you might see a Delta squadron being given this task. That's 60 some odd people backed up by some JSOC assets. So you're probably looking at a couple hundred people operating in Poland and over the border. I don't imagine these guys stay long in Ukraine. I imagine they go in and out. The CIA could probably have another 50, 60 guys doing the same thing. Maybe the CIA staying a little bit longer. If this thing's really gone big, then we're going to bring in the Green Berets themselves, the guys who specialize in this kind of activity. They might be sheep-dipped as CIA paramilitaries. I don't want to get into it, but there's a way to do that. And so, there's the potential of hundreds of Americans rotating in and out of Ukraine. Neither. The goal of the United States, unfortunately for Ukraine, is to bleed Russia dry. And they'll do that to the last Ukrainian. They're not here to preserve Ukraine. They're not here to recapture Ukrainian territory. They're not here to sustain the existence of President Zelensky. We're simply willing to sacrifice Ukraine as a nation for the singular goal of inflicting harm on Russia. That's our goal and objective. I think Poland's frustrated by that because Poland's looking for a more decisive outcome. And I think other European nations are likewise looking for a more decisive outcome. They're not, because they live in Europe, they understand what it means for a European nation to, frankly speaking, disappear, because that's what's going to happen to Ukraine. So I think Poland is expressing its frustrations, articulating, but Poland is part of a 30-nation alliance where it's consensus-driven. So the desires of Poland are irrelevant when it comes to the policies of NATO. Well, we'll start with Putin. Putin's 100% in charge, and he has extraordinary support amongst the Russian people, and he has extraordinary support amongst his inner circle. He's not under threat, under attack. He is stable. He's not in panic. This is purely a Western narrative that's part of a overall information warfare effort being run that includes mainstream media actively participating, designed to create the impression of an unstable Putin so that there could be what they call a Moscow Maidan, a repeat of the February 2014 revolution in Kiev that ousted Viktor Yanukovych. Right now, the policy of the United States and Ukraine is to try and facilitate a similar uprising in Moscow that could oust Putin. But this exists in fiction only. The reality is Putin is as strong as ever. Having said that, the general, now currently a parliamentarian, has voiced frustration with the special military operation. He feels that Russia went in too soft early on, that Russia should have gone in harder. He also feels that once it became clear that the Ukrainian government wasn't going to fold like a house of cards, that there was going to be a fight, that that's the time Russia should have begun to mobilize, that this mobilization is coming late in the game. And as a result, it's resulted in some embarrassments for Russia. It's cost Russia some lives, but he's also confident that the mobilization will be seen through and that ultimately Russian forces will, as he said, reach the border with NATO, meaning this war doesn't end until Russian forces are staring Polish soldiers straight in the eyes right across that border checkpoint. Well, first of all, I don't think the gentleman in question, Andrei Gurilov, said that Putin was making day-to-day decisions. That's not an accusation that he's put out there. Putin, well, this would have been a decision that Putin would have with the primary briefers being the Minister of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff. This would be Shoigu and Gerasimov. But also there would have been a heavy say by the Russian intelligence service and Russian security services about the state of play in Ukraine. And they would, Putin would have outlined the objective, which is his job, to say, this is what I want accomplished. Now he would turn to them and say, how do we accomplish it within the framework, within the constraints that I've set forth? He would then push back where necessary, as leaders are supposed to do, challenge certain assumptions, accept others. But at the end of the day, there will be a consensus reached on a plan that he then turns over to his military leaders, who then turn over to their field commanders, who then brief downwards. And Putin isn't part of any of that. Putin simply gives the initiating order and then sits back and waits to be briefed on the outcome. Day by day. He's not telling battalion commanders, dig in here, do this, do that. That's not what's happening. Well, it wasn't just American intel. Remember, General Miley briefed U.S. Congress in about a week or so before the conflict, the same thing. He said he thought Kiev would be taken within 72 hours. Yours truly wrote a tweet where I said this war would be over in a week or so. How did we get it wrong? I think none of us anticipated the constraints that were placed on the Russian military by the special military operation. Almost everybody who projected a war with Ukraine assumed the Russians would come in doctrinally, bringing the full weight of their military capability to play and roll over the Ukrainians. There were two assumptions there. One, that the Russians would operate doctrinally, and two, that the Ukrainians would not resist. We were wrong on both. We were wrong on how the Russians would proceed. And I think the Ukrainians shocked the living you-know-what out of everybody by putting up the fight they did. You have to give hats off to the Ukrainians. They fight like madmen. They're doing a good job. They're honoring their military service. They're losing, but that doesn't mean it's for a lack of trying. They didn't surrender as everybody thought they would. They didn't roll over and play dead. They stood up, they fought. And because the Russians came in soft, because I think the Russians had the same assumption everybody else did, that the Ukrainians were going to chew hoy and surrender. And when the Ukrainians didn't, it became clear to the Russians that they had insufficient forces to the task, and they've been playing catch up ever since. They had to go to a maneuver warfare scheme to try and shape the battlefield. Then phase two was to concentrate forces on the Donbass, which they were succeeding in grinding down the Ukrainians, killing and wounding. Kicks in with tens of billions of dollars, which was unexpected by anybody, changed the nature of the game, and now Russia's responding to it. Well, I see the Ukrainian government attempting to do whatever they can while they can. They've already stripped their reserves from everywhere to try and achieve these fences. They've pretty much burned out. Now, as soon as I say that, we're going to wake up tomorrow morning and we're going to read that the Ukrainians captured another 2 or 3 villages. Everybody's go, oh, Ritter was wrong. No, losing 2 or 3 villages is not the war, man. Losing 2 or 3 villages is the Russians saying, I'm not willing to lose 200 guys for this piece of terrain. We're going to fall back on a more defensible terrain until we get the resources necessary to redefine the battlefield. I think the Russians are going to seize the initiative. You're going to see a series of localized offensive actions designed to stabilize the battlefield, push the Ukrainians out of territory the Russians don't want them in, maybe pull back a little bit where they need to be, because General Mudd's coming in, and when that happens, Russia's going to solidify the line, complete the mobilization. Everybody I've talked to says that Russia will not achieve full mobilization capacity until sometime in December. And at that point in time, then we're going to see Russia turn over to the offensive, and it's going to be a game-changing event, I believe. In the meantime, Russia will carry out a strategic air campaign, but that campaign has to be timed to the anticipated ground assault. You don't want to blow too many things up too early and give people a chance to repair. So I think we're going to see a slowly unfolding air campaign as the Russians build up their military power, and the Ukrainians are going to continue to try and achieve some sort of miraculous victory on the battlefield. They're burning themselves out. Tragically, tens of thousands of these brave Ukrainian soldiers and tens of thousands of, I guess I can't call them cowards, but mercenaries who shouldn't be there but are dying right now. They're getting slaughtered. I mean, there's stories coming out of what the Chechens did to a particular column that, I looked at the video, and if the video is accurate, anybody who thinks that Ukraine's winning this war, look at that video. They're not winning. I mean, that's the stage we're at right now. I mean, we've discussed this ad infinitum, how we got to where we're at. But the bottom line is, the game has changed fundamentally. Ukraine changed the game by allowing its military to be transformed into a NATO proxy, and all that entails. And Russia's changed the game by transforming what had been a conflict between Russia and Ukraine / the collective West on Ukrainian soil into a conflict that's now largely being waged on Mother Russia. Ukraine has sustained an offensive drive longer than most military professionals imagined they could with the resources available. There's some documents that show that the Ukrainians have assembled around 300,000 men on the front with Russia. Now, this is a 1,000-kilometer front, which means 300 men per kilometer. Russia has 200,000 men on that frontage, which means they have the ability to put 200 men on that. But it doesn't work that way. Both sides thin out their ranks. Both sides need operational depth. And the Russians actually, it turned out in some of the battles in Kharkov, only had about 30 to 60 men per kilometer. And if you go stepping off a kilometer, that ain't enough. Yeah. And that's what's happened. So the Russians are busy trying to consolidate their lines, strengthen the lines, get a better force mix in there. The Ukrainians, though, have gone all in. They've stripped forces from Odessa. They've stripped forces from Sumy. They've stripped forces from Kiev. And they're doubling and tripling down. They're going all in. For what purpose? There's the hope that they can score a major victory, for instance, capturing the city of Kherson, or short of that, capturing enough territory in Kherson to create the impression that a Ukrainian victory is inevitable, a Russian defeat is inevitable, to create the perception that the Russian military is not up to the task, to generate, and this is the most important part, to generate unrest inside Russia. The Ukrainians have, and together with the West, have been very assiduous in highlighting being ambushed, highlighting highlighting the fact that a significant number of Russians have fled the nation to avoid mobilization. That's misleading. Nobody's avoiding mobilization. None of the people fleeing were going to be mobilized. They're all anti-Putin elements who are fleeing for purely political reasons, either to escape the Russia the way it is, or to assist Russia's enemies in magnifying the perception of opposition. They're also highlighting the failures of that have been identified in the Russian military, both in their command structure, in the mobilization, and in their performance on the battlefield, to create this a narrative of lethargy, incompetence, the inability and unwillingness to win. And the goal here is to, and this is the terminology being used by Zelensky and his crowd, is to create a Moscow Maidan. That's the goal, is basically to have a Maidan-like event in Moscow that results with Vladimir Putin stepping down, being replaced by a Russian government which will reverse all of the things that have happened, return these territories. That's their goal, and they've been egged on by the West, which, as we've talked about in the past, the so-called Russian experts aren't Russian experts. From a class of people I call the Putin whisperers, who have come into prominence since the Cold War ended. People who attained their credentials, so to speak, in the decade of the 1990s, where Russia was viewed as a defeated nation, disenfranchised, disemboweled, whatever terms you want to use, that we were exploding economically and we were limiting or neutering politically. That's the Russia that they want, and they view Vladimir Putin as an impediment to achieving that gain. They're deeply resentful of what Vladimir Putin has accomplished in Russia over the past 20 some odd years. And so they live on the notion that Russia is not a democracy, that Russia is an autocracy, that Putin rules as a virtual dictator, and that there's a tremendous amount of political dissatisfaction in Russia. I mean, in the United States, our presidents win elections, 54%, 61% of vote, generally, or they can win by 1%. The point is, even if you're elected president, there's the reality that there's a significant part of the population that doesn't support you. And in Russia, it's the same thing. It's a nation of 150 million people. Let's say Putin enjoys 80%. I think that that's a number that's artificially high because of the level of patriotism that it reflects. I think his support reflects more support for a Russian victory than it does for, I think Vladimir Putin's a great guy. I think that the number that Putin probably enjoys is probably around 60, 65%. But let's say 80. Let's say right now 80. 150 million. That means that 30 million people don't like Vladimir Putin. Right off the bat. 30 million. And so when you look at that number and you say 30 million don't like him, and you understand that the majority of this 30 million are concentrated in the very urban areas of Moscow, the politicized urban areas of Moscow, of St. Petersburg, and other major Russian cities, suddenly the number of 1,000 demonstrators, 2,000 demonstrators against the war isn't that impressive. It's not that impressive at all. And it seems that they're getting arrested, not so much because they believe in a cause, but because they're trying to create an event that is captured on film and can be played over and over and over again to enhance the notion of political opposition. It's the same thing with the numbers of people fleeing. The vast majority of those people fleeing weren't subjected to mobilization. Just weren't going to be mobilized. They never served in the military because they're of the class of people that won't serve in the military. They're not very patriotic. They don't believe in Russian nationalism. They believe in Western consumerism, and that's what they became addicted to in the decade of the 90s and afterwards. They became addicted to Western consumerism and the false promise of Western liberalism, democracy, etc. Western-style democracy. They allowed themselves to be bought out by Western interests, either directly or indirectly. And these are people who are just flat out opposed to Vladimir Putin and his brand of Russian nationalism. So, depending on the numbers you believe, between 200 and 400,000 people have left Russia. Again, when you look at 30 million as the base of people who are against Putin, we're talking about 1.5% of that have fled. It's a big deal, but it's not the end of the world. But the West and Ukraine are painting these things as indicators of the inevitable, of the inherent weakness of Vladimir Putin, and if they can just pressure him, his inevitable demise. So the goal right now is they are going all in militarily, all in. And the Ukrainian military is sending out red flags saying, hey, if the magic Moscow Maidan doesn't occur, we're in for a world of hurt, because Russia is in the process of assembling military capability that isn't just going to solidify the front line, but we now have made ourselves vulnerable from an attack from the north, towards Sumy, in between Kiev and Kharkiv coming down. There's nothing there now. Literally, if the Russians put 60,000, 80,000 troops there, they're going to come in unopposed, and they'll be able to cut off Kharkov, seize a tremendous amount of territory in rapid order. I'm not saying that's what Russia's going to do. I'm saying that the Ukrainian general staff recognizes that. They also recognize that the Ukrainians have stripped the defenses in Nikolaev and Odessa, and that if they don't achieve the victory in Kherson, and these forces in Kherson are eliminated, there's nothing to replace them, and then a domino effect could occur, which has the Russians, again, reinforced by troops coming out of Crimea, rolling through and rapidly taking Odessa. So this is the high-stakes poker game. Ukraine basically is holding a pair of twos and betting everything in the hopes that Russia doesn't have anything. And I think Russia's sitting on a full house, and they're going to run the table. But nothing's a guarantee. Nothing's a guarantee. There have been nations where everybody thought that the political leadership was rock solid, and suddenly they lost the faith of the people. And if the Russian military continues to perform abysmally, if the reinforcements are insufficient to the task, let's say Russia commits these 300,000 and the Ukrainians continue to roll up the Russian defenses, there could be a political crisis. And I agree with you that people that might replace Putin, if he could be replaced, aren't going to be left-wing liberals. They're gone. До свидания, goodbye. It's going to be even stronger, more right-wing people who are going to be talking about total mobilization, total war, not only against Ukraine, but against NATO. Very dangerous scenario. So the West needs to be careful for what it wishes for, because should the unlikely occur and a Moscow Maidan transpires and Putin is replaced, it's not going to be somebody who's willing to surrender Ukraine. It's going to go all in to defeat Ukraine. But I don't give this much hope. I'm just simply articulating my assessment of the Ukrainian position and the position of the West. And here's the thing. This Ukrainian model is unsustainable, meaning Ukraine needs to win now. They need to win right now because they are getting ground up. They took all 50,000 of the troops that were trained by Great Britain and Europe over the summer, equipped with the most modern equipment, given the best preparation. They poured them all in, and these guys are dying by the bushelful. They've reinforced them with other troops brought in from, like I said, around Kiev, Sumy, Odessa. They're dying by the bushelful. They're going all in. This is the final. This is like what the Germans did in the Battle of Moscow, 1941, where they just basically, after the muddy season, when the freeze came on, the Germans had insufficient cold weather gear. They had limited gas. They had limited everything. And what they said is just go pell-mell to Moscow, break through. And if we can capture Moscow, we can break the Russian resistance despite all of our inherent weaknesses. It failed. They were stopped 15 kilometers short, and the rest is history. The Ukrainians right now are just going pedal to the metal. They're pouring everything in, every resource, in the hope that they can break the Russians, achieve this dramatic victory they think can be politicized internally in Russia. But when they fail, the consequences are going to be dire, because the Russians have not put everything in yet. They are mobilizing, they are building, and they have, I can't believe that you mobilize without a plan. So I have to anticipate that the Russians have a plan, and this plan involves the rapid destruction of the Ukrainian military. It's like trying to climb the summit of Mount Everest without oxygen. That's a bold move, and you better get to the top, turn around and get down. But if you're 3/4 of the way up and you found out that your body isn't sufficiently trained for that, you're going to die. And the Ukrainians are going to be a long way short of the summit, and they're going to run out of oxygen, and they're going to die. They can't sustain this. Well, I mean, Europe for some time now has realized that they're prisoners of the United States, prisoners of American-controlled institutions like NATO, prisoners of the G7. We've seen Germany pushing back historically on issues like Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, saying that this Russian gas is in our vital national interests, that we define this as vital to Germany. We disagree with the American assessments, but we saw what happened. When Angela Merkel, who apparently as a woman had more cojones than any German man, it was replaced by Schultz. Schultz ended up going to the White House and being humiliated, absolutely emasculated in front of the world as he was lectured about Nord Stream 2. And now we see that at the moment when the German people rose up and said, we want the gas turned on, we're not happy with what's happening here, the United States removed that option by attacking the pipeline. And people say, well, wait a minute, nobody's admitted that. Look, I can convict the Biden administration on a circumstantial case that is stronger than the cases that have convicted many people who are sitting in jail today. We have intent, his statement of February 8th or 7th. We have motive, which is Blinken's statement about the wonderful opportunity this has. And we have means, which is the repeated exercises of U.S. naval underwater forces specifically configured and trained to carry out the mission which occurred. So you put all three of those on the table, and we have a murder, and we have the murderer. Europe is going to wake up. Right now, the political and economic elite that govern the majority of Europe are, as you said, prisoners. They're held hostage by the United States. Their entire political fortunes are dependent upon continued American support. I believe they're going to be swept away this winter. I think there's going to be revolutionary change in Europe. And when the people awaken, the people know. I mean, the German public knows darn well what happened. So the American public, Michael Rubin, who is an arch-conservative, neoconservative fanatic of war, just published a piece in the National Interest where he said, hey, Biden should do to Turk Stream what he did to Nord Stream. Meaning he just straight up saying, yeah, we blew up Nord Stream, so why don't we go ahead and do it to our Turkish allies as well? I mean, this is the kind of arrogance and hubris that usually comes before the fall. And I think there's going to be a fall. I think Europe is waking up to the fact that at the end of the day, it's Russia who's actually their friend and the United States who's actually their enemy. And I'm not going to go through the whole history of the special military operation, but I will say that back in May of this year, when the United States Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act authorizing some $43 billion of U.S. taxpayer money to be used to fund, underwrite, not just the Ukrainian military, but the Ukrainian state, basically providing a lifeline to the Ukrainian state. And this was matched by NATO countries providing heavy equipment, et cetera. I call it a game-changing event. And I got a lot of pushback from people. They're like, oh, you're flip-flopping. It's a great switcheroo. You were so pro-Russia. And I'm not pro-Russia. I'm pro-fact. I'm pro, solid analysis. And, the fact is, when Russia initiated the special military operation, they brought in a finite number of military resources for a very specific military problem, which was the liberation of the Donbass, the Donetsk and the Lugansk People's Republic. That included creating a land bridge from Crimea through Kherson, Zaporizhia. It included other supporting military actions to fix Ukrainian forces in place, etc. But still, a limited number of people for a limited problem. By infusing tens of billions of dollars worth of hardware, Ukraine and NATO and the United States literally changed the game. It no longer was a struggle between the Ukrainian army and the Russian army. It became the struggle between the Russian military and a NATO proxy. Now, simply saying you're going to provide equipment and actually having that equipment received, have the Ukrainians train on it, organize it into operational units and bring those units to the battlefield, there's a time gap. So calling it a game-changing event and actually having the game change took time. The game changed sometime in August when Ukraine started to receive these units, these reconstituted NATO units, even though they're Ukrainian manned, they're de facto NATO proxies. And then they deployed them, and starting on or about September 1st, they began this counteroffensive against the Russians. And this is where the inadequacy of the Russian force structure came into being. You have a front of 1,000 kilometers. You have 200,000 troops allocated for this task. That's 200 men per kilometer. That's not that many. But you can't just have them all up in the front online. You have to actually, have troops in the rear, in the depth, doing other things. So the bottom line is you actually had about 30 to 60 men per kilometer for the Russians. This is not doctrinal. This is not ideal. And the Ukrainians, using intelligence information provided by NATO, were able to find the seams, the weak spots in the Russian defense and exploit them. And once they punched through the defense, there was nothing in the rear to stop them. And they were able to gobble up a whole bunch of territory, especially up north in Kharkov. I think Russia woke up at that point and said, we have a problem. We have forces that are inadequate for this new reality, that this NATO army that's been assembled by Ukraine has the tactical and operational advantage. And if we don't do something, they'll get the strategic advantage, meaning they're going to change the entire narrative of this conflict. So Russia made two decisions. One was to initiate partial mobilization. That is to bring in 300,000 troops, all of whom have combat experience or prior military experience, and to organize them into units that will be brought to the theater of operations and supplement and reinforce the existing force structure, taking it basically from around 200,000 to 500,000. This is a significant thing. But the other thing was, if NATO is going to have a game-changing moment, Russia just changed the game. And the way they did that was by holding referendum. And they immediately turned this conflict from one where these NATO proxies were fighting Russian forces on Ukrainian soil, and they turned it into one where NATO proxies are fighting Russians on Russian soil. And that's a totally different thing. Russia just turned this conflict into one of an existential nature for them. They're defending the motherland, defending the homeland. This means that Russia's coming in with a completely different mindset. This is about the survival of a nation. It means that Russia can't lose, simply can't lose this. They can't afford to lose this, so they won't lose. Russia will do whatever is necessary to win. NATO, on the other hand, this isn't an existential crisis for NATO. NATO doesn't have an obligation to commit suicide for Ukraine. But NATO has overcommitted itself. They've made it too many political promises. They've provided significant, contributions, and so NATO's sort of what I call the horns of a dilemma. No matter what they do, they're going to get impaled. If they go left, they get impaled. They go right, they get impaled. There's no easy solution at this. If you go right and continue to provide this equipment, it becomes a NATO conflict against Russia. And that has the danger of expanding the scope and scale of this conflict, so that two nuclear powers are facing off, and increases the probability of using nuclear weapons. Clearly, NATO doesn't want that. We saw when Zelensky made his emergency application for accelerated membership of NATO, both NATO and the United States went, oh, no, not so fast. We don't want to have any part of that, because they know what it means. Zelensky was basically asking NATO to commit suicide. And what do I mean by that? Zelensky knows that he's at war with Russia. Zelensky knows that there was a referenda, and that from a constitutional law perspective, the Russians view the Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk as being Russia now. So if Zelensky and Ukraine join NATO, NATO will be at war with Russia on day one. And what will happen then is that NATO will cease to exist, because Russia will launch nuclear weapons and destroy all of NATO. Russia is not going to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. Ukraine does not pose an existential threat to Russia. NATO intervening in Ukraine for the purpose of seizing Mother Russia, which now Kherson, Crimea, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Lugansk, they're now Mother Russia. So now this is about people coming in and trying to seize Mother Russia. That's as if somebody came to the United States and said, I'm not at war with America, but I'm just going to take Florida. I think the United States would say, no, you're not. We're going to fight to the death over Florida. We'll fight to the death over Maine. We'll fight to the death over any part that is the United States. And that's what Russia's going to do. They're going to fight to the death for Russia. So for NATO, now, they're not willing to commit suicide. That became apparent. What NATO's going to do, however, if Can they just dump Ukraine? Remember, they just dumped Afghanistan last year. Are they going to dump Ukraine? That's the other horn of the dilemma. So NATO is going to try and find the middle ground, which is equally bad a solution. That is to continue to provide military hardware, financial assistance, to empower the Ukrainians to do whatever Ukraine needs to do, but keep NATO out of the conflict. It's that while this may be a proxy conflict, NATO itself is not going to get involved in this conflict. This means that a couple things. Tens of thousands of more Ukrainians are condemned to death because of this decision. And I think people need to reflect on that anybody that says we need to support Ukraine, you're literally saying we need to support the continued slaughter of Ukrainian soldiers. In this counteroffensive that Ukraine has run, the Ukrainians themselves have acknowledged over 20,000 casualties. Ukrainian civilians are going to die. Not only that, this conflict will probably expand to the point where Russia will be compelled to take more territories: Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, Nikolaev, Kharkov. That means that Ukraine will not just lose the 20% they already have, they probably will lose another 20%, so they could lose 40, 50% of their country before this is done. It means the death of Ukraine, the end of Ukraine. That's what NATO's done. NATO is sacrificing the Ukrainian nation for their own pride, for their own hubris. At the end of the day, Ukraine is going to lose. That's a reality, and Russia has changed it. It's right now things look difficult for the Russians because no matter how we cut the pie, they still only have 30 to 60 guys per kilometer of frontage. They're trying their best right now to consolidate their defenses, to increase the number of troops, to make sure there's interlocking defenses, etc. But until they get the 300,000 people mobilized, there's a problem. But let's talk about the 300,000 for a second. A lot of people are saying, they're going to be poorly trained troops. These aren't the elite. They're not going to be able to do what the regular troops do. I disagree 100%. First of all, they all have military experience. They've all served before. But let's just reflect on American history for a second. A guy named Rick Atkinson wrote a trilogy about the history of the United States Army in the Second World War. And it's interesting. He talks about the failures of the Army early on, the Battle of Kasserine Pass in North Africa, how we had to replace a failed general, Fredericks, with this new general whose name was George Patton. Patton sort of transformed the Army, and the Army transformed with him. It became, by 1945, one of the largest armies in the world. It was the most professional military force that was almost exclusively manned by amateurs. What I mean is that people didn't sign up to make the military their profession. They were drafted, brought in to do a job, win the war, and then come home. And they were very, very good at what they did. I think these 300,000 are cut from that same piece of cloth. These are men who had already served their nation. They're men who willingly were mobilized, willingly went off to the training, but they want to go home to their families, to their jobs, to the lives that they had that were outside of the military. And they know that the quickest way home is to get the job done, accomplish the mission. So these 300,000 are going to be singularly focused on one thing and one thing only, and that's winning this war. That makes them very, very dangerous. I think anybody who minimizes the impact that these 300,000 have just don't understand, how mobilizations in times like this work. Again, I bring up the American model. I think the Russians are going to have their own version of that. 300,000 citizen soldiers who are going to become very professional, very quick, and very focused on winning this conflict. So people need to reflect on that. Yeah, and I might be wrong with the year here. I'm thinking 1946, but I could be wrong. Winston Churchill gave a speech in Fulton, Missouri, that has gone down in history as the Iron Curtain speech. And basically that speech defined East-West relationships for decades. It was that level of a speech. The history that he brought into that, the power of his rhetoric, and the implications of what he said, and how that speech actually served as a foundation for what happened after that. This speech given by Putin will go down in history as important or more important than the Iron Curtain speech. Vladimir Putin has redefined relations between the West and Russia. He has set down a version of history that, while people may challenge it, nitpick it here and there, it doesn't matter. It's a version of history that has been encapsulated, and life has been breathed into it by the importance of the moment. And it's this version of history that's going to dominate Russian relations with the world going forward. Whether you agree with it or not, it's the version that is going to serve as the starting point. It was very firm in defining what Russia is, who Russians are, what they're not going to be, and what they're going to do. It is literally one of the defining moments of modern history. I think this speech, 100 years from now, will be viewed as probably the most important speech of this century. It's definitely the most important speech made by anybody so far this century, and I don't think there's going to be other moments like this, because this is earth-shattering. This is groundbreaking. This is game-changing. Whatever euphemism you want to use, you can add it to this speech, and it is. We in the West appear to be a little ignorant of this. We aren't paying as much attention to this speech as we should, but we will. Europe's going to. I think Europe's going to be paying a lot of attention to it this winter as they freeze to death, as their economy collapses, as their societies get shredded, not by anything Russia did, but everything they did. They're going to understand the context of what Putin spoke. And I think the United States will wake up as we become more and more isolated. We reflect on the not only the strength of what Putin said, but the accuracy of what Putin said regarding America's role in the world today. No, this is first of all, it was a brilliant piece of rhetoric, political rhetoric. Political scientists should be poring over these words, and this was very carefully scripted. Every word had meaning. I had a Russian diplomat tell me once. He said, "Scott, you got to be careful what you say, because words have meaning. Words mean something. And so when you speak and you say words, you can't just throw words out there and then walk away as if they don't matter. They matter. Words matter. And every word spoken by Putin in this speech mattered. And that's why people need to study the speech and not be dismissive of it. There's one Western leader, a former Western leader, who finally gets it. Her name is Angela Merkel. And after the speech, she said, the world would do well to listen to what Putin has said, and respect it and act on it, because he doesn't bluff. So there's no bluffing, there's no posturing, there's no artifice here. This is all genuine reality that is going to define how Russia moves going forward. So if I were the Ukrainians, I would have listened to that speech and just gone into an outright panic, which of course they did, which is why they were looking for instant admission into NATO, because for them, that's the only thing that's going to save them. It's not going to happen. Ukraine is doomed as a nation state. I don't think this conflict ends with Ukraine existing. And again, that's sort of what Putin said. When the Russian president says that all the goals and objectives of the special military operation are in play and they will be accomplished in full, that means denazification. How do you define denazification? Well, Putin just defined it. He called the regime in Kiev a Nazi regime. So denazification means regime change. The Russians have now committed formally to regime change. Demilitarization means eliminating all of the NATO influence. Putin has said that Russia is now at war with the collective West. So the Ukrainian military is, in the eyes of Russia, NATO. It must be eliminated. So I think the speech made clear what's going to happen to Ukraine and what Russia's goals and objectives are. People just need to read it and understand it and not pretend it didn't happen. Well, let's just start off with, again, NATO, the G7, they're all the same thing. They're all wrapped in the same cloak of basically working solely for the benefit of the singular American hegemony. So America is dictating policies and such. They have collectively denigrated Russia as being little more than a gas station disguised as a country. Okay, I mean, first of all, it's wrong, but let's just play the cute little game. If you're going to call Russia a gas station, then you should at least respect them as a gas station, especially when you're an automobile and that's the only gas station around. And if you want to start cutting yourself off, sanctioning the gas station, you're going to find yourself in the middle of nowhere on a 4-lane highway with an empty tank and nowhere to go. And that's where Europe is right now. The hubris of Europe to think that they could put a price cap on Russian energy, it's just ridiculous. It's going to backfire. These are people who've already dug the deepest hole possible, and they're just continuing to dig the hole deeper. The only solution for Europe was to go back to Russian energy. That was the only solution. There's no other option out there. There's nothing viable that's going to save them from this. And that's, what happened with, why the United States struck Nord Stream. And I'll tell you why I believe it. Well, first of all, let's just talk about that for a second. There are people sitting in jails around the world who have been convicted on circumstantial evidence that is weaker than the circumstantial evidence that we have regarding America's role in striking the Nord Stream pipelines. First of all, we have a clear statement of intent from the President of the United States himself, who said that if Russian tanks cross into Ukraine, he will shut down Nord Stream 2. It will stop functioning. That's the intent. Then we have a clear statement of motive from Secretary of State Blinken, who said, oh, well, it's too bad he got shut down, but this is a great opportunity. We should view this as a wonderful opportunity, a chance to do things that we always said we wanted to do. And he's supported by statements made by Victoria Nuland, by Condoleezza Rice. So we know that there's been motive. It's not just a crime of passion. This is a crime that's been considered for some time. It's premeditated murder is what it is. So there's motive for premeditation. Then we have the means. The U.S. Navy holding exercises right over the spot where the attacks occurred. Underwater exercises using the very technology that would be needed to do this. So I could indict the United States and I could win at trial because there's not a jury out there that would say, nah. I think really the nation that built the pipeline did it. The nation that benefits from the pipeline's existence did it. And remember, how does it benefit from the existence? You say, well, it didn't pump. It's not pumping gas. I mean, the Russians, maybe they wanted to, stop the, well, they already did. It's called an on-off switch. If Russia doesn't want to have gas flowing to Europe, they hit the off switch. But Russia wants gas flowing. How do we know? The Russians said, we want to sell you gas. We want to have Nord Stream 2 up and running. And what was happening? The German people, angered by the policies of their government, were going to the streets. And they were starting to demand that their governments turn on Nord Stream 2. And any democracy where you have the people demanding something, a politician that fails to comply with the demands tends to get voted out of office, removed from office. And German politicians were starting to make noises as maybe we need to do something here. So what did the United States do? Took the decision out of their hands. Pop, 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 pop. No more Nord Stream 2, no more Nord Stream 1. So even if the German government wanted to turn on the pipeline, they can't. And that's what the United States did here. They did it. Now, I think this is just going to make matters worse for Germany right now because Germany literally has no options now. There's nothing they can do. The United States can't provide enough liquid natural gas to compensate. Germany can't afford the prices that will be charged for this. So Germany's doomed, literally doomed. Their economy is going to shut down. Hundreds, if not thousands, of people are going to die this winter, die from exposure. And who's to blame? The United States, 110%. It's the Americans' fault. And the sad thing is, all of Europe knows it. This isn't a secret. All of Europe, even in the United States, where we pretend, the Russians did, the Russians did. Well, Michael Rubin just wrote an article in the National Interest where he said, hey, maybe Biden should do to Turk Stream, the Turkish pipeline that feed gas into Southern Europe, what he did to Nord Stream 2. He doesn't say what he did, but we know what he means. Blow it up. He said Biden, so he clearly said Biden shut down Nord Stream 2. Biden did it. Well, why? Because Biden said he was going to do it. But now we're talking about attacking the Turks. We declared war on Europe. That's just a statement of fact. We declared war on Europe. We destroyed a $12 billion piece of European energy infrastructure. We have condemned the German economy to collapse, a collapse that hasn't been seen since the end of the Second World War. We're responsible. Right now, the German political and economic elites aren't willing to divorce America. They can't. They're like an abused spouse. They just keep coming back for more. But over the course of this winter, I think you're going to see these political elites removed from office. I think you're going to see these economic elites becoming irrelevant because you're not too elite of an economist when your economy is collapsing. And they're going to be replaced by new power structures that will be more inclined to view the United States as the problem and Russia as the solution. So I believe in the long term, this will backfire dramatically for the United States, that there's no way the United States walks away from this unscathed, because right now, the damage to Germany is still theoretical. At some point in time, it becomes reality, and that reality brings with it a political consequence. Look, when Vladimir Putin initiated the special military operation back in February of this year, he made it clear that if NATO intervened, that Russia would respond with all of the means available to it. And the assumption there was that this included Russia's nuclear arsenal. But it also meant that Russia would respond with considerable non-nuclear conventional capabilities that hadn't materialized, and still haven't materialized. So it wasn't exclusively nuclear. What he was saying, though, is that for NATO to come into Ukraine and interfere with what Russia was doing would put NATO in direct conflict with Russia, and that Russia would do whatever it needed to do to ensure it didn't lose that conflict. So he's putting NATO on notice. He's done the same thing here by saying that if NATO, because literally by changing this conflict, by holding the referendum, by mobilizing 300,000, he guaranteed that if all things stay the same, Ukraine is going to be defeated. The only way Ukraine could survive is if NATO got involved. So he said Russia will use all the means available to defend Mother Russia. This includes nuclear weapons. But the Russians have also been clear to say, we have a doctrine. It's a published doctrine. And there's only two circumstances under which we use nuclear weapons. One is if you attack us with nuclear weapons, we respond with nuclear weapons. The other is if there's a conventional threat to Russia that threatens the existence of the Russian state itself, then we use nuclear weapons to counter that threat. Ukraine, in and of itself, does not constitute such a threat. Ukraine can't win this war. Ukraine can't threaten Mother Russia, not in the long term. NATO could, and so that's why Putin said this. But the doctrine would require NATO to intervene and then invade Mother Russia and seek to seize territories away from Russia. If NATO is not going to do that, then there's literally no threat of nuclear conflict, none whatsoever. But here's the problem. How did Joe Biden respond? First of all, Joe Biden makes up the threat. Russia is going to use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. Russia is not going to use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. It's going to happen. But in the West, we've created this threat. And then we turn around and we communicate to Russia, if you use nuclear weapons, we will respond decisively. It'll be catastrophic for you, but it'll be non-nuclear. We're not going to use nuclear weapons in response. It's all going to be a non-nuclear response. And there's some in Russia that went, why wouldn't they use nukes? That might mean that if we nuke NATO, the United States won't respond because the United States is scared of our strategic nuclear deterrent. And so there's some in Russia right now who are starting to think, so if NATO gets involved, we could nuke NATO and get away with it. The United States would back down. And that's ignorance on the part of the Russians, because the United States nuclear doctrine, which is also published, clearly states that if nuclear weapons are used against the United States or its allies, that the United States will use nuclear weapons in response. So this is the danger. On the surface, there's literally zero risk of nuclear weapons and nuclear war. Why? Because it could only happen if NATO were to intervene in a way that empowered Ukraine and the NATO forces to strip away lands belonging to Mother Russia. Both the United States and NATO said, we don't want anything to do with that. We're not going to do that. Boom. So that pretty much takes that off the table. But now you've created a potential where people are not embracing what all five permanent nuclear powers embraced at the beginning of the year. You remember there was a joint statement where they said nuclear wars can't be won, therefore they should never be fought, and that we should all work to ensure that nuclear wars are never fought. Now you have people on both sides saying, we could win a tactical nuclear war. We could win that. We could bluff them. We could escalate and we force them to de-escalate. And you have people thinking the most insane thing in the world, which is to use nuclear weapons. There is no such thing as a limited nuclear war. Any nuclear conflict will turn into a general nuclear exchange at some point in time, which means the world ends. I don't lose sleep thinking that Russia is going to nuke Ukraine. I do lose sleep that there are people on both sides of this equation who are considering the potential of winning a limited nuclear conflict. And this is very dangerous, very, very dangerous. And all it takes is one miscalculation. All it takes is somebody in Russia to decide that NATO has gone beyond simply providing arms. For instance, that some people could say that. There's a feeling that the Ukrainian army that's fighting right now is supplemented by Western mercenaries in such quantities that they could constitute a de facto NATO military presence. There's also a feeling that many of the troops fighting for some of these Ukrainian formations are actually Polish troops, which now makes what's going on NATO. And if the Ukrainians continue to win on the battlefield and start seizing territories that are now Russia, this could spin out of control very quickly. So on the one hand, there's no reason for nuclear war to be fought because the conditions shouldn't exist. On the other hand, because both sides appear to be misinformed about what the nuclear doctrine of the other side is, some things are being talked about that should never be talked about. We have to look at it from the big picture. Before there was a special military operation in Ukraine, there was December 17th, 2021, where Russia provided NATO and the United States with a draft treaty that described the conditions for a new European security framework. Russia basically said that it could no longer tolerate the expansion of NATO up to its borders. It could no longer tolerate the forward deployment of NATO forces along its borders, in that it now needed to have a new European security framework that put restrictions, binding restrictions on both parties, not just Russia dictating to the West, but Russia responding to the concerns of the West as well. This was dismissed by both NATO and the United States, which helped lead to one of the precursors for the current conflict. Russia hasn't backed down. That's still their ultimate objective, is to achieve a new European security framework. Now, a couple things have to occur in that. One, you need total victory in Ukraine, not partial victory, because Russia can't dictate a restructuring of European security framework if there's still a Nazi regime in Ukraine using NATO weapons to bleed Russia dry. That's not good. So Russia's going to have total victory, and I'll get to that in a second. But Russia also needs to have a Europe that's willing to enter these negotiations, and that's not going to happen so long as Europe is totally beholden to the United States. But I believe because of the failed policies imposed on Europe by the United States, that there's going to be revolutionary transformation in many parts of Europe this winter, and that the Europe that emerges from this winter will be far different than the Europe that enters this winter, and it will be a Europe that might be more inclined to consider a new European security framework. And one of the reasons is because the political structures right now that serve as an impediment to this, NATO, the EU, G7, are all, there's no unity there. I mean, Biden can talk all he wants about unity. There's no unity. NATO's at war with itself. I mean, what do you say? When the polls say the Germans owe us $1 trillion in reparations, and the Germans say, really, we might take Silesia back from you. That's not unity. When the Turks are ready to go to war with the Greeks over the Aegean Islands, and France is ready to side with Greece against Turkey, that's, NATO's more in danger of going to war with itself than she has basically called the European Union, trash, called the Euro trash. She wants to divorce Italy from this. And what happens when the German economy collapses? The foundation of the Eurozone is gone. Can the Eurozone survive? As more nations seek to rally around issues of national sovereignty as opposed to European collectiveness, the EU collapses. The G7 is supposed to be the 7 most influential economies in the world. They're not that influential anymore. They're going to become less influential once this winter's finished. So politically, these structures are gone, and I think Russia is going to be in a position to successfully negotiate a new European security framework with post-conflict Europe. But a prerequisite to that is winning this war. What does winning look like? I think winning looks like the following. Russian troops advancing all the way up to Ukraine's borders with NATO. That means the total destruction of the Ukrainian military and the total elimination of the Ukrainian government and the various governing structures in Ukraine, to purge them of the ideology of Stepan Bandera, that Ukrainian ultra-nationalist, Nazi-loving, murderous thug who's responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Jews, hundreds of thousands of Poles, hundreds of thousands of Russians, who currently is the national hero of Ukraine. To exist as a modern nation state, that whatever Ukraine looks like once this conflict ends, it won't be the Ukraine when this conflict started. It won't be the Ukraine today. I think Russia will take even more territory, but it will be a total victory of Russia over Ukraine, a victory that sends a signal to every nation in Europe that war is not the answer, that if you go to war with Russia, this is what happens to you. And I think the Russian victory has to be that complete, and that's what Russia's moving towards. Vladimir Putin hinted at this in his speech, and the mobilization of 300,000 troops, combined with there's an additional mobilization of 70,000 volunteers undergoing right away. So it's not 300,000; it's 370,000, probably closer to 450,000 by the time all the volunteers get processed. These troops combined with the 200,000 give Russia more than enough military capacity to do this. I think Russia is going to be unleashing a strategic air campaign that hasn't existed yet, that is going to shut Ukraine down, destroy it economically, make movement almost impossible. If Zelensky doesn't die from bombing, he's going to be forced into hiding. He won't have the ability to communicate freely with the rest of the world. All of this is about to happen. And when it does, it'll point to a total victory of Russia on the battlefield, the elimination of Ukraine as a modern nation state, and a post-economic crisis Europe that has been transformed through its own internal revolutionary processes to empower a new class of political and economic elites who will be more inclined to work with Russia, less inclined to do the bidding of the United States. Look, I think the Ukrainians are just, they're childlike in their behavior, petulant child. The only problem is children don't, the misbehavior of children doesn't result in the deaths of tens of thousands, which is something Zelensky brought up. Look, his proposal has a snowball's chance in hell. Russia has already enshrined these four territories into their constitution. So the notion that a businessman is going to come up and somehow convince the Russians to undo their constitution and give up these territories to yet another referendum is absurd in the extreme. It's unrealistic. Zelensky, Elon Musk, his heart might be in the right place, but it's literally it's going nowhere. But be that as it may, the intent was there. What he said is it's going to end up this way anyways. Why don't we just accept reality and save tens of thousands of lives? And if you were a president of a country and you were confronted with the fact that you have lost this war, because, ladies and gentlemen, this week Zelensky was confronted with the fact that he lost this war. He's burned out his reserves. They're done. The vaunted counteroffensive is over. Yeah, look, tomorrow they might launch an attack that takes another 3 villages. It's over. His reserves are expended. He has nothing left. The West can't replenish in time. The Russians are in the middle of mobilizing troops. Once they get those troops online, it's over. And we saw this. Zelensky went off the rails, unhinged today, calling for NATO to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against Russia. Well, guys, you got to do this. You got to teach the Russians. This man's insane, literally insane. It's sad to watch. It's the mental deterioration of an already unstable individual sitting there just spouting, lunacies. He's asking NATO to kill the entire world because anybody knows that if you launch a nuclear strike against Russia, their immediate response is to launch everything against everybody, and it's over. So Zelensky's unhinged. You can't reason with this guy. Moreover, you can't reason with the pro-Ukrainian crowd on social media. There literally is no debate, dialogue, discussion, permitted. Hell, they have an intelligence service that kills you for simply speaking out. That's just not me making it up or putting a spin on it. The CIA has acknowledged that. New York Times published a piece where the CIA has come to them and basically said, the Ukrainian service went in and assassinated Daria Dugina. Wow, what does that mean? You know what the assassination is of a journalist who speaks out again? It's called political terrorism. It's literally U.S. code. It's an act of terror. That means that the Ukrainian intelligence service is a terrorist organization by American legal code, and the Ukrainian government is a state sponsor of terror. Last time I heard these terms thrown about, the United States tends to bomb people who get these labels. What are we doing to Ukraine? Chastising them. Well, don't do this. Very bad of you. Which tells me something. It tells me that the CIA isn't leaking the truth. The CIA is covering its butt, and we can get into that later. But I'm convinced that the Ukrainian service didn't have the sophistication and the network in Moscow to carry this out. That they inherited a network provided by the United States and/or Great Britain. A network that got the operative in, took care of the operative, received the operative, gave the operative the weapon that was going to be used. The operative was already trained on the weapon, and then had an exfiltration plan that took the operative to a friendly country, pre-briefed on her arrival. This is sophisticated stuff. The CIA does it all the time. The British do it. I don't think the Ukrainians are that good. So what the CIA was doing is, because the Russians know this, the Russians are putting two and two together, and the Russians are building up these networks and reconstructing them. And what the CIA is doing is trying to put a narrative out there that puts the onus on the Ukrainians, hoping that the Russians will get distracted by that and stop digging. But the Russians don't get distracted. Their intelligence services are very thorough, and the Russians know the truth. There's no amount of hiding that the CIA can't cover up its tracks. But that's what's going on here. This is the CIA's effort to put up a smokescreen, because the truth is they killed Daria Dugina. And this is what's disturbing. She's on a list that I'm on, that other Americans are on. And the CIA is killing people on this list on behalf of the Ukrainian government. When is Congress going to start holding the hearings that Congress should be holding? Well, they can't, because they all voted for this. They all voted for the money that funds the organization that produced this list. This list wasn't produced in the shadows. It was made public at a meeting organized by the United States Embassy and attended by the State Department. The second meeting in September, where they called people like me information terrorists, but get rid of the information, just focus on the terrorism part. Treat them like a terrorist. The State Department was in attendance, along with all of NATO. All the freedom-loving people in the world were there at an event funded by the U.S. government, put on by an organization the CIA just labeled an international terrorist organization, sitting side by side with a state sponsor of terror, which sort of makes us collaborators. So this is just insane where we're at today, where if you speak out, you don't just get banned from Twitter. Look, getting banned from Twitter, I was getting pretty good at Twitter. I'm not going to brag, but I was mastering the art of 244 characters. And I saw my followership go from 12,000 to 98,000 in about a month and a half. I know, according to Elon Musk, many of those were probably bots. But some of them were real people. And the whole purpose of the Twitter page, the Twitter thing, my daughter set it up because I had written a book, and she said, you got to market the book. You got to get out there and market yourself. And literally, Twitter denied me access to 98,000 potential book buyers. I'm not saying all 98,000 would have gone out and bought the book. Just imagine if maybe 10,000 bought it. That's a lot of books sold. Maybe 1,000 bought. That's still a lot of books. Even if 100 bought, that's more than I would have gotten otherwise. So getting shut down from Twitter, yeah, I'm a little disappointed in it, but it's not the end of the world. What is the end of the world is having somebody blow up your damn car with you in it. And that's what these people on the list do for a living. Have happened to them. So, no, this is problematic, and the U.S. government's doing this, and we need the American people to wake the hell up, start calling their elected representatives, especially those who voted for the bill that funds this, and ask them what the hell they're doing. Elon is the man. Everything Elon does is beautiful. Hey, Elon, baby, let me back into Twitter. No, I don't think he would have yielded. I think warmongers can disrupt things. For instance, it's now common knowledge that John Bolton and Mike Pompeo sabotaged any potential nuclear deal with North Korea. And as what's interesting is, as you know, some of the material that was taken from Mar-a-Lago apparently were the love letters between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. But people who are now becoming familiar with the content, because that content was highly classified, not because it gave away sources and methods, but because it talked about personal communication with the president of a sensitive nature. The fact is, the deal that Kim Jong-un was putting on the table is real, very real, which is even more reason to condemn Joe Biden today, because Joe Biden knows what that deal was, but they sat around and did nothing. And now we have a nuclear North Korea that says we'll never talk denuclearization again. Fact is, if you guys keep playing these stupid war games, we're going to talk nuclear preemption, which means Seoul's gone, Tokyo's gone, maybe California loses a couple cities. Yeah, North Korea will be turned into the Stone Age, will be eliminated, but does that do the millions of people are going to die any good? I mean, Joe Biden is a failed president. Literally, he's a man who cares nothing. He's destroyed his allies. He destroyed Afghanistan. He's destroying Ukraine. He would destroy Georgia if he could. He'll destroy South Korea. He'll destroy Japan. He doesn't care about. He'll destroy Taiwan. That's next on the list. He doesn't care about anything. He's wrapped up in this notion of American, narcissism. The world revolves around us. We say something that must happen. Really, Joe? How about the deal you cut with the Saudi begging the Crown Prince to increase oil? And the Crown Prince, well, maybe 1 million barrels a day, but not to wait for the August meeting. That OPEC plus meeting, plus being Russia, and so with the Saudi Crown Prince said basically is a stick in your ear. We got to go talk to the Russians. The Russians hold your fate in your hand. And guess what Saudi Arabia and Russia just did? Cut oil production by 2 million barrels a day. 2 million barrels a day. The United States is screwed right now. Joe Biden doesn't know what to do because he's been artificially lowering the price at the pump by releasing these strategic reserves so he can tell people, look, I lowered gas prices. Well, Joe, you didn't, because when this crisis started back in January, I have a photograph of my local gas station. It was $4.19. I went in to pay. By the time I finished paying, it was up to $4.39, and the price ain't gotten anywhere near $4.39 since then. So, hey, Joe, it's all on you, buddy. It's not Putin's price tag of Putin's gas tax. It's Joe's failed policy. But now Biden is oil prices are going up. They were the Russians and the Saudis were basically saying we need oil to be at $70 a barrel. Russia has come out and said that's what we base our budget on. So when we budget forecast for the next year, we budget based upon the premise that the average, per barrel price is $70. And we don't want the United States and Europe coming in and putting price caps, because that's what they were talking about doing, putting price caps that would keep the price lower, which means you'd bankrupt Russia. And so the Russians went to OPEC and said, you do understand that if they price cap us, they price cap anybody. That's what they do. And the Saudis got it. Everybody got it. So what did they do? They said, ain't no such thing as a price cap. And you want to prove it? Europe and America? 2 million barrel a day cut. Watch the price. Shot up to $100. Price cap that, Joe. You can't. It's over. I mean, the guy is ruining America now. He's not only ruined Europe, he's in the process of ruining America. Why? Any damn economist worth their salt would have told him that. So where are these advisors? We criticize the neocon warmongers that surround Donald Trump, and they deserve to be condemned. John Bolton amongst them and at the head of them. But where are all these so-called the adults in the room? All the smart liberals, the clear thinkers. There's nothing clear thinking about them. These guys are literally the dumbest people on the planet. Anybody who would advise President Biden that sanctioning Russian energy is a good idea is a fool. And Europe's learning that right now. Europe, it's too late. Europe, sorry, it's going to happen to you. Over. Your economies are gone. Irreversible damage. It's sad, but the fact is, Joe Biden did that to Europe. The Europeans are waking up to that fact. And I think this time in the spring, the United States isn't going to be welcome too many places in Europe. Prior to the INF Treaty, the notion of on-site inspection, that is taking human beings from one side and having them physically go on the territory of the other, have been shot down by both sides because there's absolutely no trust, none whatsoever. We didn't trust them. They didn't trust us. But necessity dictated that we get rid of these intermediate nuclear force weapons before we kill ourselves and the world with us. And from that necessity came the need for an improved compliance verification mechanism that went beyond national technical means, satellites, and things of that nature. And there was a recognition that if we wanted to survive, we had to learn to build trust and allow an inspection regime that included significantly, in fact, the lead element of it were humans like me, on-site inspectors. In the 1980s, things were not good between the United States and the Soviet Union. I know people today are basically saying, "Oh, it's never been this bad." Well, it was. It was bad in the 1980s. It was very bad in the 1980s. And yet we found a way. Now, I agree that the United States has made it very difficult for anybody to trust the notion of a treaty or agreement, because it's not just the agreements with the Soviet Union and Russia that we've pulled out from. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the INF Treaty, Open Skies. There's my book, Disarmament Time of Perestroika. You read it, you'll become the smartest person in the world about arms control. Well, second smartest, because I think the author's pretty good. But the CFE treaty we corrupted. We're in the process of corrupting the START 3 treaty, or the New START treaty. Why would anybody ever trust us? The JCPOA. Look at the Iranians. They signed a deal with Barack Obama. Trump withdrew from it, and now Biden's trying to renegotiate it. So who the heck is going to ever trust us again? And I agree with you that the United States is going to have to earn trust. It's going to require a new leadership. But here's the problem with the leadership. Every 4 years, we elect a new president. And the problem with this, the amount of executive authority that we grant a president, is that new president could decide that treaty is no longer convenient and then begin the process of withdrawing from it. So it's not just that people are going to have to learn to trust America. America is going to have to make itself trustworthy. How do we do that? The establishment, that we call it, is composed of people of a certain age who are educated at certain institutions that convince the people who graduate from these institutions that somewhere in this room there is sitting somebody who's going to change the world, somebody who's going to be in the room when that decision's made. And so the thing is, we get all like-minded people, all educated the same way, all shaped with the same career paths. That means that when it comes time to make that decision in the room, they all make the same decision. We have to break that pattern. We have to find a way to, and I'm not saying Harvard should go away, Georgetown should go away, anything should go away, but these institutions have to take it upon themselves to break the chain of domination and bad thinking that produces this establishment, this deep state that you want to call it. The military has to do the same thing. We have to start, and I'm not saying become woke. I'm saying that we just have to start bringing in people who think differently, have a different approach. Well, the problem is, first of all, yes, and we did that in the 1980s too. There were a lot of outreaches. The story of Samantha Smith is an endearing story, and he wrote back, and then she visited, and they started, they started these exchanges, and the sister city concept is pretty cool. Juneau, Alaska, amazing in this day and age, has voted to maintain their sister city relationship with Vladivostok. But yes, getting the people-to-people exchange basically helps to deprogram people from the pre-programming that's taking place constantly, where they're taught to hate Russia, distrust Russia, etc. You can break free of that by having this people-to-people contact, and I think that's a wonderful thing. But at the end of the day, it's government that makes these decisions, negotiates these treaties, etc. It's Congress that ratifies these treaties, and until we get people in these institutions that think differently, we're trapped. And academia produces the experts that populate these various power centers. So that's why I was focusing on academia. I'm as confused as you are. The special military operation, when you're talking about initiating conflict with a country that has a standing army of 260,000 and reserves, immediately available reserves of anywhere from 400 to 600,000, and you're only bringing in 200,000 troops, this is, I'm confused. Now, that leads me to believe that there were a lot of, premises made on by the Russians, like they supposed, or they anticipated, that if they put shock and awe type pressure on Kiev, that the Ukrainian government might collapse and flee. That if they made rapid advances into Ukraine and presented the Ukrainian people in military with a fait accompli. Oh my God, Kherson fell, Kharkiv fell, everything fell. We surrender. We're not going to do this. That they could get away with that. So I call that Special Military Operation Phase 1. About 10 days into Phase 1, it became clear that ain't going to happen. The Ukrainians were fighting. They're fighting like cats and dogs. And the Russians had to regroup. And now we come to what I call Phase 1.2. And this is where Russia said, okay, now we need to shape the battlefield. So they continued to put their deception on. Kiev. They're never going to take Kiev. They were trying to bluff Kiev into surrendering, but they were never going to launch a frontal assault against Kiev. But now they had to continue to make that push to freeze reserves in place, threaten Odessa, and all this stuff to shape the battlefield so that they could move to Phase 2, which was accomplishing the primary task of taking the Donbass. But here's the deal. If you're going to move to Phase 2, which is taking the Donbass, again, I'm just a simple Marine. I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I can read a damn map. And I know that if I've pushed up and seized Kherson, and I'm working on creating a land bridge through Zaporizhia, through the Donbass, that I am now creating a front line that's 1,000 kilometers long. And if I bend that up towards Kharkiv and join in at Sumy, and then extend it over to Kiev, I have now 2,500 kilometers of front line. With 200,000 troops, I mean, do the math. And this doesn't add in all the little bends and curves and everything that's taking place. You could probably make it 3,000 miles of a front. Now, you have 200,000 troops and 3,000 kilometers. If it was 1,000 kilometers, that would be 200 troops per kilometer. It's 3,000. So 200 gets divided by 3, 6, 12, 18, about 65 men per kilometer. Hey, I invite everybody in this that's watching this right now to go out and walk a kilometer and take a look at the terrain. Now imagine defending that with 65 guys. But it gets worse because that implies that you have everybody on the front line. But what about the rear areas? What about protecting the lines of communication? What about the guys that ain't frontline fighters, the artillery guys, the logistic guys? So when you reduce those 200,000 to actually about 60 to 80,000 combatants, and now you got 3,000 kilometers, you got, call it 60,000 guys, you're down to like 20, 30 guys per kilometer. Can't do it. And this was predictable. So if you're going to shift to Phase 2, you begin mobilization at that point in time. Or you should have begun mobilization much earlier than you did. They didn't. They made a decision, I believe, was politically motivated internally because they didn't want to panic. Imagine telling the Russian people, we screwed up, they didn't surrender. No, you got to say, everything's okay, we got this under control, don't worry about it. And they shaped the battlefield sufficiently so they could take control in Donbass. They did. They captured the city of Mariupol, very tough fight. They succeeded in getting the land bridge in. They started the grinding operation against the most heavily entrenched area in the world. And they just started grinding them down. And they had an algorithm in place that was basically crushing the Ukrainians. We're talking 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15 to 1 casualties. But here's the problem. The initial Ukrainian defense, because, when the war started, neither NATO nor the United States thought, nor I'll be the first to admit it, thought the Ukrainians were going to last that long. I mean, General Miley briefed Congress, says 72 hours, Kiev is going to fall. Yours truly said they ain't going to last a week. Right. Well, they did. They did. And suddenly everybody in NATO woke up and went, whoa, this is a fight. This is a fight. How we have to support these guys now. So they began this process of beginning to mobilize support. That's when they started to elevate Zelensky to God status, Winston Churchill status, King Leonidas status, the defender of democracy and the whole works. They invented this wonderful little phrase, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. He never said it. The CIA said it. Doesn't matter. He said it. He's God. And then Europe began mobilizing, United States began mobilizing. And then the next thing you know, you have a game-changing event. You have the Ukrainian army, which is in the process of being destroyed. In fact, it was destroyed. People need to understand that by late June, the Ukrainians had suffered over 60,000 dead and over 40,000 wounded. That's 100,000 casualties. No army can take that kind of casualties and less. But They did, because what were doing is they were throwing in their territorial reserves and pulling out their experienced fighters. They were basically buying time with bodies. These guys are, they're throwing these poor territorial reservists in there just to get slaughtered. But they took these other guys out and they were getting trained in the United Kingdom and France and Germany and Poland. And they assembled the reserves. They equipped them with all this NATO equipment, HIMARS, M777s, Caesar artillery, German artillery, Czech artillery, all this new artillery, all these tanks, everything. Then they trained them, not the old plodding Ukrainian way, but the new NATO way, speed, maneuver, etc. And they were giving them brilliant intelligence from the United States and NATO that picked the exact weak spot in the Russian line where they could come in, hit this one village, punch through, and put everything into chaos. And they implemented this. They basically launched an attack against Kherson, the south, after telling everybody, I mean, not too sophisticated on the Russians' part, I have to say, Zelensky, 1,000,000-man army, gonna retake Kherson. And the Russians are like, oh, we have to defend Kherson. Why don't we strip everything we got, bring it down to Kherson? Hey, First Guards Tank Army, come on down there. Come back here. 20th Combined Arms Army, send half your guys down here. Everybody this way, Kherson, defend Kherson. And the Ukrainians went, let's attack Kherson, fix these guys in place. They read the Russian playbook, apparently. The Russians were fixing them in Kiev. Well, the Ukrainians surrounded, fixed them in Kherson. The Russians are fixed. And it looked good early on. The Russians were like, hey, we're slaughtering these guys. 2,000 casualties, 1,000 casualties, 3,000 casualties. We're kicking ass. Well, not so fast, because then the Ukrainians flipped up and attacked in Kharkov. They picked a perfect seam right where SWAT teams were defending, not military, but SWAT teams. And they punched through, got in the rear, and the Russian defenses deflated. They had to retreat very rapidly, leaving equipment behind, ammunition behind, to build up a new defensive line that had more than 30 guys per kilometer. And the Ukrainians did this, but they're losing casualties, significant casualties. But it's that point where the Russians realized we have insufficient resources to the task. Again, I believe they should have recognized this long before that. Almost everybody. I mean, in May, I said they have insufficient resources to the task. And again, I'm just a silly Marine. But September, even the Russian high command went, we have insufficient resources to the task. So began the mobilization. More than 300,000. The 300,000 are the mobilized troops. They have an additional 70,000 volunteers coming in, patriotic Russians who said, even though we didn't get a slip, we want to sign up. In addition to that, they have about 80,000 are being trained, other volunteer units. The Chechens are pouring guys in. So they're going to have, all in all, a little bit less than 500,000 new troops coming in. That's a lot. That's in addition to the 200,000 Russian troops they have and the 80,000 Donetsk, Lugansk, and other forces they have. So we're talking close to 800,000 Russians now are going to be taking on the Ukrainians, who just earned, there it is, I believe 800,000 is needed. That's what they got in the West, 800,000. And the Ukrainians, the intelligence right now says that they pushed 300,000 troops, and that's everything they got. They got nothing left. 300,000 up there. They got 50,000 off in Europe getting trained. They're not going to be ready for another month or so. This 30,000, though, about 70, 80,000 of them were these highly trained NATO guys. And when I say NATO, I mean NATO. The Lugansk governor is saying, hey, all these guys that were fighting, 80% of them ain't Ukrainian. Most of them are Polish. A lot of them are English and Canadian and American. We're fighting a lot of mercenaries. They're not really mercenaries. Mercenary is a person who, soldier of fortune. These guys are what I call sheep-dipped warriors. They've set up this whole network of private military contractors where you can go, and they call it, there's a term they use that implies you're providing executive protection, but you're not. You're a NATO soldier. You get paid $2,000 or $3,000 a day. I mean, that's pretty damn good money. I might go do that. So I could pay off my college debts. But the point is, they're getting paid really good money for this stuff. Who's paying for it? The U.S. taxpayer. U.S. taxpayers doing that. But they're getting paid. They're getting trained, and these guys are the cutting edge. They're the front force. They're the assault forces. They're the guys running the deep penetration missions. And they're all burned out. They're burned out. They've used up their equipment. They're getting slaughtered on the battlefield now. They bang their head up against the wall. They push the Russians back as far as they're able to push back. Like I said, tomorrow they're going to wake up and you're going to find 2 more villages got captured. You go, Ritter, you're wrong. You're wrong, Ritter. You're an idiot. Okay, I agree. I'm an idiot, but I'm not wrong. The fact is, they've burned out their reserves, and Zelensky knows it. And Zelensky has his military guys telling him, boss, we ain't got nothing left. You took everything from Odessa. You took everything from Sumy. You took everything from Kiev. They sent the Presidential Guard in. The Presidential Guard has been deployed. There's nothing left. So what happens now? They're all burned out. They've overinflated the balloon, and the Russians are coming in. And by the end of November, December, they're going to have 800,000 forces assembled. And these aren't just, everybody's like, hey, there's 300,000 reservists, man. Well, yeah. Read history. The United States Army, World War II. I have it right up there. Rick Atkinson's trilogy talks about the United States Army during the Second World War. By 1945, we had the largest, most combat-capable army in the world, almost exclusively manned by amateurs, by draftees, guys who didn't volunteer in 1940 and 41, guys who were sitting home saying, I want to stay home with mama. I want to stay home with my job. I don't want to go to war, but they were drafted. And what they realized, these guys, they weren't sitting there going, USA, USA. They were going, damn, okay, the quickest way home is through the enemy. Finish the job, we get home. And that's what Russia has right now. They have 300,000 guys just like that. Guys who, if you look at their faces, it's resigned. And it's not resigned fear, it's resigned, okay, determination. We're going to do this. You, damn it, okay, we got to go. Honey, I'll be home when we get the job done. And the wife is saying, come home when you get the job done. And they're going to get the job done. This is the thing. And everybody's going, well, they're going to be given old equipment. Have you seen the videotape of the stuff being shoved into the front? Everybody thought that the Russians had all their old Soviet gear in mothballs. They're like, this stuff's not even going to work. It's brand new damn tanks, brand new artillery, brand new vehicles. It's all new. What the Russians have been doing for the last 8 years is producing new stuff, and it's been going into the stockpile. So when they mobilize, these are going to be trained. Remember, the 300,000 are already trained. They've been to the military. Most of them have already been brought in and assimilated in existing units. They put all the units up to speed, and these guys who were just in like a year or two ago, I mean, they, like me, they probably put on a little weight, a little slower, maybe some arthritis, but they still know what they're doing, and they got their refresher training. Now they're in. The other guys up forming fresh units. It's all over for Ukraine. It's literally all over, and Zelensky knows it. That's why he's talking insanity. I think Vladimir did a good job of providing, he had fresh insight into the Russian mind when it comes to issues of arms control, et cetera. Russia's not going to annex territories that aren't Russian. That's just a straight up statement that I believe. Anytime you listen to Putin talk about this, Putin talks about the Russian nation, talks about the Russian people, and the places that he basically annexed already are Russian-dominated territories. There's about 4 more in there, maybe 5, that have Russian majority populations. Odessa, Nikolaev, Dnipropetrovsk, I hope I said that right, and Kharkov. And then I think north of Kharkov is Sumy, I don't think that's the name of the place because of the CH chair or something. Chernigov. These territories could very well be annexed into Russia in the next wave of annexations, assuming that Russia does what I think they're going to do and launch a very successful operation. The question is 100% correct in noting that in order to achieve demilitarization and denazification, Russian troops are going to have to go to the border with NATO. That doesn't mean that they're going to stay on the border with NATO. Russia doesn't want to have a border with NATO. So, there's some realities. For instance, I believe that Russia will take Odessa and that they'll tie in with Transnistria, and eventually Transnistria will become part of Russia. And good luck with that. And so that's there. I believe Kharkov will become part of Russia. I think Nikolaev already is. They've assumed some parts of Nikolaev become, Kherson, so they read on that map. Dnepropetrovsk. I should know that because I used to be, Pavlograd was the missile factory that I was going to help build a START portal monitoring facility there. So I studied it and prepared for it, and then he shipped me back to the Marine Corps. But so I should remember that because I used to know how to say it. I don't know if they're going to take that. I don't know how deep they're going to go. I do think Odessa and Kharkiv at a minimum. I think Nikolaev's got to go. We'll see. But the point is, even when you take all those territories and Russia assumes constitutional sovereignty over them, the only border you have that's problematic is Transnistria, but that borders with Moldova, who's not a NATO nation. So you still don't have a NATO buffer. I mean, you still aren't buffered up against them. What is a buffer state going to look like? That's the $1 million question. We know that once Russia's set in process of precedent of carving up Ukraine, and Hungary has some claims, Romania has some claims. I think there might be some Slovakian claims, and Poland has a huge claim. all of Western Ukraine used to be Poland before Stalin drew a line and said, "No, we're going to give it to you. It's all yours." Ukraine, part of Belarus has total claim on this. They were part of that land swap too. So there's a lot of people out there basically saying that we have a claim on this territory. How's this going to play out? I don't know. I mean, a dangerous. And I'm not saying I'm against what Russia did. It's really none of my business. But it's a dangerous precedent. It's a dangerous precedent. You've started, and the Russians will say, "Hey, we didn't start this precedent. Kosovo, NATO started this precedent," and they're right. I agree with them. But you just carved up Ukraine, and Crimea you can get away with because anybody but a fool knows that was Russia. Donbass, you have a legitimate claim on that because of the behavior of the Ukrainian government and the resistance that was put up by the population there. Kherson, Zaporizhia, man, I mean, come on, that's tough. You just took two lands. I know there was a referendum, but during war, did everybody vote? What about all the people that fled? Again, Russia did what Russia did, and that's Russia's business, and the world's going to have to adapt to it. And it's funny, and let's just throw this one in. So Zaporizhia was annexed by the Russians. On Zaporizhia's territory is the nuclear power plant. Russia's now taking control of the nuclear power plant, which means that under the NPT, Russia has to declare this to the International Atomic Energy Agency and say, this is ours now. And now the IAEA has to come in and redo a safeguards agreement with Russia. But how can they? Because nobody recognizes Zaporizhia as being part of Russia. So what happens to the IAEA when Russia says, here's our declaration, you have to come in and do it? Very interesting question. Here's another one. If Zaporizhia is not part of Russia, why did the European Commission just sanction them? They sanctioned the territory of Zaporizhia. Legally, they can't, because if Zaporizhia is occupied territory, you can't sanction occupied territory. So Europe just basically de facto said, yeah, you're part of Russia, we're sanctioning you. I mean, there's a lot of tricky little inconsistencies going on here, but it's a dangerous thing what has happened here. I understand why Russia did it. I'm not condemning it. I'm just saying straight up, it's a dangerous precedent, and it leads to tremendous uncertainty about what the fate of Ukraine is. Zelensky is basically looking at a country that is disintegrating before his very eyes. Hey, Volodymyr, I'm telling you right now, you lost Odessa. You're going to lose Kharkov. You may lose others. The longer you keep this war going, more you're going to lose. And by the time this is done, Poland may come in and take Western Ukraine. Romania and Hungary may come in and take their population centers. And you're going to be left this little rump state, except you're not going to be left with anything because you're a dead man walking. Literally a dead man walking. The Russians are either going to kill you, or your intelligence is going to kill you, or your army is going to kill you, or you're going to flee Ukraine, take residence somewhere, and 30 years from now, somebody's going to drive an ice pick through your head because you basically are responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and the destruction of a nation. Well, I would think, a short answer is yes. I think there's no doubt that there was a global underestimation of Ukrainian capabilities, and I think not NATO capabilities, but NATO willingness to expend tens of billions of dollars to build up a de facto NATO proxy on Ukrainian soil. In Russia, I wouldn't say that we overestimated Russia's capabilities. What I would say is Russia hasn't lived up to its potential. When you have the First Guards Tank Army, which is supposed to be able to bring 30,000, knuckle draggers to the front line and defeat NATO head on, but what makes them work is this concentration of power, and you disperse them on a frontage where they only have 60, 80 guys per kilometer with no depth. You lost every advantage you had by creating the First Guards Tank Army to begin with. And this is the problem. It's not that the Ukrainians are so much better than the Russians or the Russians are so much worse than the Ukrainians. It's that when you put 7,000 guys, highly trained with modern equipment, up against 500 guys, the 7,000 will win 100% of the time. And that's what the Ukrainians were able to do. They were able to assemble sufficient force, given place and time, find the seam, and exploit it. Now, the professionalism of the Russians is following. In 1944, the German army, considered one of the most professional militaries in the world, studied the destruction of Army Group Center. Here it is, the Germans dug in, defending, but like everybody else, insufficient resources. So what did they do? They had thinly defended lines because they'd sent all their reserves elsewhere. They sent it down to the south. They were up by Leningrad. They're opposite Moscow. They had this thinly defended line with no depth, very little reserves. And what did the Russians do? The Russians came in, found the seam, and boom, went right through it. But when they punched through that line, the Germans literally panicked, threw down. It was one of these slaughters. It was similar to what happened to the French in the Battle of Smolensk and when they invaded Russia in 1812. The French just lost all cohesiveness, dropped their weapons, ran. They got to the river. They drowned. The Cossacks came in, sliced them up. Well, the same thing happened. The Germans basically gave up, ran, and the Russians followed, the Soviets followed behind, and it was mass murder. And yet, when you look at Kharkov, again, I think I've mentioned this before, but let's just take away the map, remove the map. And if I say the Russians and the Ukrainians just spent 2 weeks fighting head to head, the Ukrainians lost 5,000 guys. The Russians lost 200 guys. Who won the battle? And most people would say, well, the Russians won that, hands down. But now we throw on the map and they go, oh, the Ukrainians won. Not really. The Russians, even though it was rapid, it wasn't panic. They didn't panic. They didn't, sometimes they had to make choices. Hey, Lieutenant Schmuckatelli, put a Russian name on that. Did you fuel the tanks last night? No, sir, I didn't. Well, bad luck, dude, because here come the Ukrainians. We got to go, leave the tanks. And the Ukrainians rolled in and they captured a bunch of Russian tanks. But they didn't get the Russian guys, and Russia has more tanks. So at the end of the day, the Ukrainians burned through their stuff. It's not about the Ukrainians are better or the Russians are bad. It's that the Russians did not have sufficient resources to the task. That's about to change. As I said, the Russians are about to go from around 260,000 troops in the area to about 800,000. And aim, set, match Russia, nothing going to stop them. And, NATO needs to stop puffing its chest out, because I'll tell you right now, NATO ain't got 800,000 knuckle draggers ready to take on Russia in Western Ukraine. Well, it is extraordinarily for it, and it's been, the Ukrainians have been digging in opposite Donetsk since 2014. The Bakhmut area, where there's a lot of fighting taking place right now, it's literally trench line after trench line after trench line, tree lines with trenches, connecting trench, communication trench, bunker, bunker, bunker. Everything's fortified. And it's done in a way that you can penetrate the trench line here, but then the others will fire in on you. You penetrate too deep, they'll get around you. The Ukrainians have built this extraordinarily, intense is the wrong word, but elaborate defense system, in depth. I mean, we're talking, it goes all the way through the Donetsk region. And the Russians, look, I never fought this kind of war in reality. I do know in the Marine Corps we trained to do it. It's some of the most interesting training. The reduction of a fortified position, it was called, and we brought in our company and we plan it how to suppress bunkers while you take out a bunker. But if you didn't do it right, you lost a lot of guys quickly. And if you got into the defenses without properly suppressing other defenses, you got surrounded, you got killed quickly. So the assault of a fortified position is extraordinarily difficult. It's up there with combat in an urban environment as being some of the most difficult places you can fight. And what have the Russians been doing all summer long? They've been fighting against these fortified positions, and they're not hardly losing anybody because they're not doing it the Marine Corps way. The Marine Corps way is, they did a little straight up the middle. Boys, base of fire, maneuver, 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 and all this kind of stuff. The Russians are like, hey guys, if you got them, smoke them. Artillery, go. And the artillery just blows the living hell out of the Ukrainians until the Ukrainians do that make the work easy for the Russians. They retreat to the next defensive line. Then the Russians come in, clear out that defensive line, settle in, and then they repeat. It takes a long time. That's why the rate of advance is so slow. There's a lot of people out there going, oh, look at the Ukrainians. They just went 70 kilometers. Yeah, who was there? Nobody. The Russians, you punch their line, the Russians withdrew. So I can advance 70 kilometers if nobody is opposing me. It doesn't make me Rommel. The Russians, on the other hand, they're going, they only advance 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers. Yeah, come on, man. You can't compare the two. I can, because the Russians, in advancing 5 to 10 kilometers, killed 30,000 Ukrainians. The Ukrainians, in advancing 70 kilometers, killed 200 Russians. Again, simple Marine, not the greatest mathematician in the world, but even I recognize that the disparity in numbers plays out in Russia's favor. The history of Jews in Russia is one of pogrom after pogrom after pogrom after pogrom. It's not an exaggeration. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, whenever there was a problem, domestic problem, the way that local governors, helped bleed off the steam was to say, blame the Jews. And then everybody rode through the nearest Jewish village, trampled them, killed hundreds of them, drove them out, etc. And that's true. I mean, Fiddler on the Roof is just a musical, but it's based upon a historical reality. So yes, and then in Soviet times, not as much. I mean, look, I didn't live there. What I'll say about this, look, anti-Semitism exists everywhere. I mean, you want to see anti-Semitism? Come to America. It exists. It's everywhere. That doesn't mean that the Jews are oppressed. It just means that anti-Semitism exists. And am I going to sit here and pretend that anti-Semitism didn't exist in the Soviet Union? Of course it existed. But if you look at the early Bolsheviks, they're almost exclusively manned by Jews. I mean, some of the most famous Bolsheviks were Jewish. So the notion that the Jews were this underclass is wrong. I think Jews could succeed in the Soviet Union as individuals. I think the Jewish nation, or the concept of the collective Jews, I think there was still prejudice. We know this. We know in the 1960s. A lot of Jews wanted to leave the Soviet Union because they felt that there was oppression. And in fact, I interviewed a guy, on the Scott Ritter show who basically stormed the Israeli consulate and demanded that the Israelis open up the Aliyah, the return of Jewish people to the homeland, and pressure the Russians to do this. And they began a process, but it didn't go as effectively as people wanted. In the 1970s, the United States passed a law. I think Scoop Jackson was behind it. I forget what the second name of the law is, but it's the Jackson something law that sanctioned Russia if they didn't allow more Jews out. And it was problematic until the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then suddenly all the gates are off, and the Jews that wanted to flee could flee. And I mean, over 1 million of them, or 600,000 to 1 million of them, went to Israel. Others went to the United States, others went to Europe, and many stayed. Now, am I going to pretend today that to be a Jew in Russia is perfect? No, because does anti-Semitism still exist? Yeah, but ask yourself, why is the Israeli government and the Russian government so tight? Because the Israelis and the Russians know there's a large Jewish population in Russia, and there's a large Jewish population of Russian immigrants, and they two stay together. The fact that you could freely immigrate from Russia today, and many Jews choose not to, tells me that life in Russia isn't as oppressive as it was in Tsarist times. Now, the question is of karma. Look, I've said this over and over and over again. If you take the laws and the policies of the current Ukrainian government, and you remove the term Russian and you add the term Jew, you basically have the same the same mindset that Nazi Germany had in the 1930s before the Holocaust began. So I actually believe that Russians are waking up to the fact that there is this thing called irresponsible prejudice, that, painting the entire people with a brush, so you have a problem with Putin. That doesn't make every Russian evil. They're learning, that the Ukrainians view them as orcs. I know personally a lot of people who are just stunned by the level of hatred of Ukrainians towards the Russians. Now, anybody who studied Western Ukraine, studied Stepan Bandera, studied the organization Ukrainian Nationalists, either B for Bandera or M for the other dude, know that, no, this is deep-seated. It goes back a long time. But the reality is there's no pogroms in Russia today. There's no limitation. Jews can. I don't think there's a glass ceiling in Russia for Jews. If you're qualified, you can get promoted. You can get the job. You can work in government. You can do anything you want. I'm not going to pretend that life is perfect, but because I don't know. But I just don't see the prejudice today in Russia that historically existed when it comes to Jews. And one of the reasons is because of the good relations. I mean, one of the reasons why I believe this strongly is because of the good relations between Israel and Russia. Those relations wouldn't be as tight if the communities weren't communicating with one another and et cetera. So, yeah, karma's a bitch. Excuse my language. That's just an old saying. But and maybe Russians who are listening to this can reflect on their history. But here's the thing about history too, and this is where I get in trouble with other people. I'm not a believer in the sins of the father become the sins of the son kind of thing. And what I mean by that is, okay, so in Tsarist Russia, bad things happened. But we are several generations removed from that. And we have a generation of Russians today who survived a couple tough things themselves, like World War II, 27 million people killed. They survived the 1990s, which, unless you lived in Russia at the time, you have no freaking clue what was going on there, the absolute collapse of a society. And Jewish people were part of that collapse. They experienced that collapse. And the ones that didn't flee, who remained behind, know damn well what it was like there. And they've seen the rebirth of it. So I'm thinking that the mindset of Russians today is not geared upon reliving past mistakes, but geared on instead moving forward collectively as Russians. And yes, Jews are considered a nationality in Russia, but they're still Russians. They're Russian citizens, and I think they identify with their fellow Russian citizens, and they understand what it means to live in Russia. Yes, Russia is becoming a Christian nation. Russia's always been a Christian nation. I mean, the role of the Orthodox Church in Russia, yes, is becoming more and more important, especially when you compare and contrast to what happened to it at the end of Tsarist times, the suppression and oppression of the church during Soviet times, but now the Russian church is there. It's very important. But this is not Tsarist Russian Orthodoxy. The Orthodox priests aren't running out saying pogrom, pogrom, pogrom. And I think there are people who, and there's a great point somebody punted up, Russia voted for the creation, they led the way for the creation of the state of Israel. Russia's the one that took the lead and said there's going to be a state of Israel. So I just think, yes, karma is there and all that, but I don't think too many Russians living in Russia today are worried about karma. I think they're collectively concerned about the threat posed to Russian national security by the expansion of NATO and by the Russophobic policies of Europe and the United States. I think that unites everybody, whether you're an Orthodox Christian, whether you're a Chechen Muslim, or you're a Jew living in Russia today. The most precious asset any nation has is its people. And the Russian military has made it clear from the start of this special military operation that they put high value on Russian life. They put a high value on all life, to be honest. They could slaughter far more Ukrainians than they have been. And I'm afraid that when the gloves come off, and they will be. But the Russians, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, I think that they have waged a conflict more humanely than any other nation in modern times. They have gone out of their way to avoid civilian casualties. They've given the Ukrainians every opportunity to surrender when maybe they shouldn't. I don't mean kill prisoners. I mean, if I got you in a cauldron, kill you. Don't pause and say, hey, Ruki Verik, hands up. Just kill them all. They're there. They attacked you. You got them in a cauldron. Kill them all, assault through, and keep going. But the Russians have been taking prisoners, which is very noble of them and very, to their credit, that's awesome. I mean, that's like saying, why can't we train everybody to be a Marine and do away with the Army? Because the Marine, obviously, and I believe this, is a more offensively oriented person, more assault oriented, more aggressive on the field of battle, more tuned into, the details of small unit combat. The Russian airborne forces are the same thing. In fact, as you take a look on the battlefield right now, the fire brigades, the guys who are doing a lot of the fighting, are these Russian airborne troops. They're very motivated. But first of all, ask yourself why there isn't a bigger Marine Corps in the Marines. So there was this recruiting poster that used to have, if everybody could be a Marine, then there wouldn't be Marines. And what that means is the Marine Corps attracts a certain kind of person, a certain mindset. I'm not denigrating soldiers. Soldiers are awesome. But there it is, Sturm Brigades. Descent, I knew the D was Desantnik, and I knew that she was Sturm, but the B I was struggling with, but obviously Brigade. And it's also expensive to train a Marine. It's more expensive to train a Marine than it is to train a soldier because the training's different. The training's longer. And you don't need Marines for everything. The Marines are good at certain things, but the big Army can do things big that the Marines can't do. But there's just not enough people who want to be Marines. There's not enough people, because it's tough. It's really, really tough. And I would imagine it's really, really tough to be a Russian paratrooper. I don't think it's a walk in the park. I think it takes a special kind of guy to say, I want to be at the Desantnik. I want to jump out of perfect airplanes using a parachute that works less than 100% of the time. Right off the bat, you got a crazy person. And then they're trained to be very aggressive in their tactics. And you see it on the ground. Very aggressive, very professional. But not everybody's cut from that piece of cloth. I'll tell you right now, the 300,000 guys that they're mobilizing, they don't want to be paratroopers. If they wanted to be paratroopers, they'd have been paratroopers. Maybe some of them were paratroopers in the past, but they're not buying into that. They're buying into, let's get the job done. It's and here's the other thing too. When you have, a paratrooper brigade is more expensive than another brigade because of the training. And you basically, you train these, if you take these assault units and you treat them as regular forces, because that's what he's basically saying. Why can't we turn everybody into an assault brigade? then you're just basically burning out elite troops. There's a time and place for elite troops to be brought into the situation, but war is a meat grinder. And sometimes you don't want to take your filet mignon and throw it into the meat grinder. Sometimes you want to take, a lesser cut of meat. And that's a harsh way of saying it, but that's just the reality is the not everybody's cut out to be a paratrooper or a Marine, and not every situation requires it, and it's not cost effective. Normally, I would say something like, that sounds like a conspiracy theory to me. Except, again, it doesn't take a Nobel Prize winning economist to look at what the U.S. policy has been and predict what the outcome will be. It doesn't have to be a CIA thing. American policy appears to be to allow Europe, or to encourage Europe, to commit suicide, to destroy the industrial potential of Europe. And some people would say that the Americans did this on purpose to encourage the flight of industries from Europe to the United States. And we already see that. Audi is talking about locating to the United States. Why? Audi's not a German company. Audi's a multinational company. Audi and other multinational companies have these things called boards of directors who believe in the bottom line. Boards of directors aren't married to a location. Yeah, I mean, they'd like to stay in Germany, that good German technology, good German mechanics. But boards of directors do things like, are we making money? And right now, Audi can't make money because in Germany, they can't afford to pay the energy costs. They don't have access to the raw materials. The price of working on an Audi automobile makes it impossible to produce an Audi automobile because the market says an automobile should cost X, then you sell it for X plus whatever to get your profit margin. But if you go too high with the cost of the car, nobody buys the car of a certain class. But now, because of everything the United States has done, the car costs X times 4 to produce. Nobody has that kind of money. You can't afford to produce it. You're not going to be able to sell it. So either shut the whole thing down or relocate to a place that has the potential to produce automobiles at the right cost. And right now, the United States is that place. And again, this isn't serendipity. This appears to be the plan of the United States. Why else would we destroy Germany? I mean, Germany is the economic engine of Europe. You don't know that, you don't know anything about Europe. You take Germany away, the rest of Europe fails. Maybe the French claw on for a little bit. Maybe northern Italy can claw on. But bottom line is everybody else goes to hell in a handbasket. And what kept Germany functioning was cheap Russian gas. This is why the Germans were always opposed to any effort by the Americans to shut off Russian gas. From going back to Schroeder, Schmidt, the whole work up to Angela Merkel, they all went, no, we're doing the Russian gas because we know what makes us tick. This is what makes Germany competitive, viable. Well, what about American LNG? Well, no, it costs too much. And you can't guarantee the same flow that the Russians can. What the United States has done is basically destroy Germany. Think about it. We attacked a $12 billion piece of critical energy infrastructure. This is like somebody coming in the United States and taking out the refineries in the Gulf Coast. And we go bonkers if someone did that. We declare war if somebody did that, to be honest. Why is Germany allowing this? Why is Germany saying nothing? Why is everybody just being silent? I mean, I could convict Joe Biden on the circumstantial case that exists as I speak. Intent. He said he was going to commit the crime. If Russian tanks cross into Ukraine, I will take out Nord Stream 2. Intent. Motive. Blinken. This is a great opportunity. I mean, normally you would think if Germany's a close ally of the United States and somebody attacks a $12 billion piece of critical energy infrastructure, that the United States would be saying, because you remember, we're an energy exporter ourselves. We produce energy. We have critical energy infrastructure. So if somebody took it out, we would say this is a horrible thing. Somebody took out this critical infrastructure. We condemn this wholeheartedly. This is an irresponsible action. This is like somebody looking at the Twin Towers collapsing and go, a bad day for New York, but this is a wonderful opportunity for us. Really? Do you think after 9/11, anybody said this is a wonderful opportunity would have been condemned? Should be condemned. Blinken just said this is a wonderful opportunity. Meanwhile, Germany's screwed big time. It's over for Germany. Lights out. Not so fast, because imagine ordering the assassination of somebody, thinking you got away with it, and all of a sudden, one of the 4 people that you thought you killed wakes up and goes, "No, I'm still alive. I'm still good." And that's what happened with Nord Stream 2. We popped off. We're supposed to destroy all the pipelines. And one of the Nord Stream 2 pipelines, because there were 2 of them, one of them went, "No, I'm okay. Yeah, I'm fully functional." And the Russians are going, "Yeah, we can turn this one on anytime we want." What is the United States going to go back, murder them again? But Germany needs to wake up to the reality that the United States is not their friend. We're not their friend. How can you be their friend and attack this infrastructure after successive German leaders said this is critical to the national security and national survival of Germany? How can anybody in Europe be our friend? How can Ukraine be our friend? I mean, if the Ukrainian put on their thinking cap for a second, it's, wait a minute. The United States came in, said they're going to support us. We've sacrificed 100,000 of our people. And now the United States is backing away. So basically, we got hung out to dry. Yes, all of Europe is being hung out to dry. We don't care about you. Understand that. When we say we care about NATO, we only care about an organization that serves in the interests of the United States. We don't care about the constituent members of NATO. When we say we're allied with the G7, we care about a bloc that votes for American policy, American-centric policy, but we don't care about the constituent members of the G7. You know, the interesting thing is the G7 is supposed to be the 7 most developed economies in the world. Talk to me in the spring, baby. How many of these European nations are going to be in that list? Not many. You know who's going to be in the list? BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Throw in Iran, throw in Argentina. No. So, yeah, I don't view that question as a conspiracy theory anymore. It can't be, because the facts align with it. The reality supports it. America is carrying out a policy that seems to be singularly focused on destroying Europe as a viable economic entity, driving that business from Europe to the United States. The Russians will say that they do not have what we would classify as tactical nuclear weapons, for instance, the equivalent of the B-61 bomb. Russia does have nuclear-armed theater ballistic missiles. But they aren't used to take out, battlefield positions. They're designed to take out command and control leadership positions, etc. The Russians basically have the following philosophy. There is no such thing as limited nuclear war. The concept of tactical nuclear weapons is based upon the premise that we can fight a low-level nuclear war. We can use nuclear weapons and be limited to the battlefield. It grows out of the NATO doctrine of the 1960s, 70s, 80s. It said if the Soviets come across the border, we can hit them with tactical nukes, blunt their attack, and by doing so, compel them to understand that the next level would bring even more harm. So maybe they will stop them. They'll reconsider. It was stupid, because the Russian thing was, if you nuke us, we just take you all out anyways. Sort of what their policy is today. But we have tactical nuclear weapons. They don't. They don't have a doctrine that incorporates it. So all this talk right now of the Russians using tactical nukes against Ukraine is absurd. They don't have a doctrine that allows for it. 2, they don't have the weapon systems that do it. Russians don't do that. Russians use nukes in 2 ways. 1, you nuke us, we kill everything. 2, if you threaten the security of Russia, we kill everything. There is no, we're only going to kill you a little bit. You know, in the United States, people keep talking about escalate to de-escalate. That's the Russian theory. The Russians don't have it. They've published their doctrine. There's literally nothing in Russian doctrine that says escalate to de-escalate. Escalate to de-escalate is if if the Russians are coming at you, or NATO's coming at you with overwhelming conventional power, that the Russian will use a tactical nuke to blow up something, and that's an escalation to get NATO to go, oh, we don't want to do this anymore, back off. It's not in Russian doctrine. That's not how they work. You know who works that way? America. We're the ones who built low-yield nuclear warhead that goes on the Trident submarine that has been tested in a war game where we escalate to de-escalate. So once again, America has mirror imaged its own nuclear philosophy onto the Russians, and people are buying into it. They're running wild right now. And Russia keeps saying, hey, all this talk about nuclear weapons bothers us. We're a little nervous about what your intent is, but we don't operate that way. All we've ever said is that if you threaten the security of the state of Russia, we will use all the weapons at our disposal to defend ourselves. But you need to understand that before the Russians engage in an activity, which they acknowledge once they do it, the world is over. I mean, Putin has said straight up, we'll be martyrs. You'll just be the guys that started a nuclear war. But he acknowledges that all the Russians are going to die. He's not pretending that Russia can win a nuclear war. He knows Russia can't win a nuclear war. But, you know, there are a lot of weapon systems short of nuclear weapons that the Russians can bring to bear before they go to do that. Understand that before Russia ever fires a nuclear weapon against Europe, that they'll have used hypersonic weapons to take out every major command and control center, decision-making center in Europe. That NATO headquarters will be a smoking hole of the non-nuclear variant. Russia has a lot of options available to it before they go nuclear. So anybody who thinks that Russia just goes from A to Z, it doesn't work that way. Russia knows as well as anybody what the consequences of using nuclear weapons are, and that is the death of everybody. So Russia's not going to do it. No, not at all. Russia can sustain this economically. First of all, this war hasn't impacted the Russian economy in a meaningful way. The Russian defense industry has, because the Russians went in with a peacetime military mobilization. So they didn't mobilize. They had existing forces. Those forces have resources allocated to them based upon projected potential combat. These were forces that were designed to fight against NATO. So believe me that every single one of these rifle divisions, tank divisions had the petroleum, the ammunition, everything lined up in reserve. They've been bringing them in. I think the length of this conflict, we saw Dmitry Medvedev had to go to Tula, a strategically important city located to the south of Moscow, and ask and just say, look, we need to up military production. So, why? Well, because you're burning through stockpiles at a wartime rate. So you need to get the things put up. But Russia's been producing a lot of these weapons with this kind of conflict in mind since 2014, when Russia was awakened to the fact that the West was trying to destroy it. February, the Maidan in Kiev, in the West, we're sitting there sort of chuckling, hey, we got rid of Viktor Yanukovych, chuckle. In Russia, they're about getting rid of us. This is about regime change. We're not playing that game. They started redoing everything in their military, to include starting to build the tanks that we see coming to Ukraine now and stockpiling sufficient quantities of weapons. But the Russian economy hasn't been disrupted by this. Even with the partial mobilization, all Putin did is said, we're going to refocus effort on the defense industry to get them up to wartime production. But the rest of the Russian economy is clicking along. And remember, when you're building your budget on $70 a barrel for oil, and the price of oil has been over $100 for some time, the Russians are rolling in they're in what's surplus. They have budgetary surplus. Some people talk about 30 billion. Some people talk about 100 billion. The bottom line is they ain't running a deficit economy like us, by the way. So the Russians can afford this. Now, I don't know what happens if this war continues for years, but I don't think this war is going to continue for years. I think the mobilization means this war is going to be over, and I've said it before. I think this war fundamentally ends by the summer of 2023, and I think Russia has it all tied up politically by early 2024. I think Russia's out of the pipeline building business for Europe right now. There are existing structures. There's the Turk Stream that comes in through the south. There's Nord Stream that can be repaired, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, and there's existing pipelines. But Russia's not in the business of saving Europe. Europe has dug its own grave. I think these nations are going to have to evict their current political and economic elite. I think that's going to happen this winter. And then they're going to have to convince Russia that this will never happen again. And that isn't that convincing. People talk about, the United States needing to rebuild trust with Russia. Europe has to rebuild trust with Russia. Europe has abandoned Russia. Europe has condemned Russia. Europe has attacked the Russian people. So I don't see Russia going, hey, no big deal. Let's put together another $12 billion energy infrastructure project so the United States can bomb it and Europe stays silent. I don't think Russia's in the pipeline building business. But again, I'm not a Russian. I don't sit on the board of Gazprom. They are businessmen. And if somebody could convince them that this is good business, who knows what they're going to do. But I have a feeling that Russia's in the business of building pipeline connectivity with China, with India, with the nations that didn't abandon, the nations that didn't sanction them. So I think that's what their economic, priorities are going to be in the near future, not reestablishing relations with maybe Hungary. Hungary has sort of tried to stick it out and do the right thing. But Italy, hell no. The other countries, not in your life. They are doing, from the Russian perspective, they're doing everything wrong right now. I mean, even Giorgia Meloni is not saying the right things from the Russian perspective. So I don't see the Russians bending over backwards to build infrastructure that helps Europe.
Dan Pride from Oregon. That's in the United States of America, by the way. Did Russia vaccinate their forces, Dan wants to know? If so, how many and when? This story was running around in social media, and it's one of those stories that gets planted by pro-Ukrainian forces that are designed to disrupt the mobilization, demoralize people, etc. The policy of the Russian government is that vaccination is voluntary, and they do not forcefully vaccinate anybody, and they're not forcefully vaccinating the Russian soldiers. There may have been some districts that got a little overzealous in making the vaccine available, but no, they're not in the business of vaccinating soldiers that don't want to be vaccinated. The Turkish military would destroy the Greek military, hands down. The Greeks wouldn't stand a chance. Greece would, of course, be backed up by probably the United States providing military equipment, and France indicating they would provide support. But the French Navy doesn't want to get close to the Turkish shore. I'm not anti-Greek, but when the Turkish president brought up Smyrna, 1922, he wasn't joking. The Turks don't like the Greeks. There's a lot of animosity, and the Turkish military is just qualitatively better than the Greek military. So it would be a slaughter. Regime change has been the policy of the United States since at least formally 2009, when Michael McFaul instituted what's called the reset. Reset wasn't reset; it was regime change. It was about replacing Vladimir Putin as the key political figure in Russia with Dmitry Medvedev. That failed, and the United States has been in the business of promoting regime change in Russia ever since then. That's what the Maidan coup in Kiev in 2014 was an indirect way of promoting the destabilization of Russia. And today, we have an active regime change. What do you think the sanctioning of the Russian people was? What that policy was? It was regime change. It was designed to punish the Russian people to the point that they would rise up and remove. We've been promoting Russian opposition figures. Navalny is a paid CIA asset. What is the purpose of Navalny? To create a political opposition to do what? To achieve regime change. We want Putin gone. We want Putin replaced with somebody who will more closely replicate the period of time in the 1990s, a Boris Yeltsin type clone who will allow Russia to be totally economically and politically subjugated by the West. That is what regime change is. Bolton at least was honest enough to give voice to it, but it's been the official policy of the United States since at least 2009. First of all, they haven't lost so much modern equipment. There's been some losses, but it's the Ukrainians that have lost. All of the equipment Ukraine had when they started this conflict is gone. They're now totally reliant upon NATO to provide them with modern equipment, and much of that equipment was just destroyed in these two offensives against Kherson and Kharkov. Russia has lost equipment. I think the Ukrainians right now are bragging that they have equipped units with the captured Russian equipment. Okay, hundreds of tanks, hundreds of armored fighting vehicles. Russia's just flowing in thousands more. So whatever Russia lost is easily being replaced, along with the troops to operate it. So I think Odessa will fall just fine to the forces that Russia is accumulating. Let me put it this way: Russia is finally bringing sufficient force to accomplish the mission. That hasn't been the case at any time since the beginning of the special military operation. That can't be said anymore. And that sufficient force includes not just the manpower, but the modern military equipment that this manpower will fall in on and use. The referenda that were held in Kherson, Zaporizhia, those are two oblasts or provinces that have been occupied by Russia. They were, prior to this referenda, sovereign Ukrainian territory. And also the referenda were held in the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic, which used to be sovereign Ukrainian territory, but in February of this year, the populations there held referenda to declare their independence, and this independent status was recognized by Russia, and that's what led to Russia's carrying out the special military operation, which was ostensibly in support of these two newly independent republics. They've now all voted to become part of Russia, and the Russian government has agreed to this. The referenda are controversial. While Russia cites the United Nations Charter and the notion of the right of people to choose their own way, to self-determination, I think it's widely recognized around the world that to hold referenda in a time of war, especially where the war is divisive in nature, Ukrainian populations that may have voted against this referenda have fled. So one can't speak of the totality of the population participating. So there's some controversy there. On the other hand, Russia's made it clear that it's not playing games. It conducted this referenda with the objective of transforming these formerly Ukrainian territories into Mother Russia, and that changes the entire character of this conflict. It's no longer a conflict between Ukraine and Russia being fought on Ukrainian soil. Starting today, because Vladimir Putin has signed off, it's official. These territories are Russia as far as the Russians are concerned. This is a conflict being fought by Ukrainians on Russian soil. And this, I believe, is going to allow Russia to redefine this conflict, redefine the legal characteristics of this conflict away from a special military operation, which was designed to liberate Donetsk and Lugansk from Ukrainian oppression and Ukrainian threats, to the defense of Mother Russia. Russia has mobilized 300,000 troops in support of this. And I think we're going to see Russia come at Ukraine with a different military approach, one that is broader in scope and scale, one that by the time it's finished may result in 4 additional Ukrainian provinces being absorbed by Russia, that being Odessa, Mykolaiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kharkiv. You see the destruction of the Ukrainian military, and to see regime change in Kiev with the Zelensky regime being evicted and a pro-Russian regime putting in. These are Russian, I believe, will be the Russian objectives. Claiming to have an objective and accomplishing the mission are two totally different things. So it's yet to be seen whether or not Russia will be able to do what it says it, or what it's positioned itself to do. But be that as may, we're seeing a definite change in the conflict in Ukraine. It's becoming broader in scope and scale. We already saw that it changed from being a Ukrainian-Russian conflict to being a NATO-Russian conflict. The Ukrainian military that's operating today is a de facto proxy of NATO. It's trained, equipped by NATO. It's provided intelligence, communication support, logistics support by NATO. This is why Russian President Putin, when he spoke of the referenda, he spoke of a conflict between Russia and the collective West, not just Ukraine, but the collective West. NATO and nations who aren't members of NATO who are also providing assistance. So this is a fundamental confrontation between Russia and the West, which didn't exist when this conflict first started. This has become, for Russia, an existential conflict. That's an important term, because that means that Russia is fighting for the very survival of the Russian state. Defeat is not an option. Russia cannot lose this conflict. The question now is the collective West viewing their support of Ukraine to be existential in nature? Are they going to put everything at stake? And when I mean everything, I mean the survival of their respective nations. Russia is willing to use nuclear weapons to defend the Russian state. Is NATO willing to use nuclear weapons to defend Ukraine? I think the answer is no. But NATO has been caught by the Russian actions. I believe NATO has been put into what is known as a horns of a dilemma, meaning no matter what they do, they're going to get impaled on a horn. There is no good option. They've overcommitted to their support for Ukraine. They continue to say that they're going to provide support to Ukraine to recapture the former Ukrainian territories. But that means that now Ukraine will be invading Russia from the Russian perspective, which Russia will, of course, up the stakes. I don't think NATO is willing to double down on this, which means NATO is going to suffer another embarrassing defeat if Russia defeats Ukraine, a defeat along the lines of Afghanistan, but even worse, because this is in their backyard. They've committed everything. But I think it's a defeat that NATO will have to absorb, because the consequences of going to war with Russia are just too great. It's a very dangerous situation. I don't know if the world's woken up to just how dangerous the current situation is. It's extraordinarily dangerous. If you start on February 24th, and that's your starting point, yes, Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine. And people would say, well, that's a war of aggression. But this is not about starting on February 24th. This is about starting back in February of 2014 with the coup d'etat, the U.S.-backed coup d'etat in Kiev, where a president, Viktor Yanukovych, who many people call Putin's puppet, but he wasn't. He was elected by the Ukrainian people. And you can't be Putin's puppet if you were in the process of considering the pivoting of Ukraine towards the European Union, which is what led to the Maidan demonstrations to begin with in 2013. Yanukovych was presented with a decision. Do you pivot away from Russia and go to the European Union, or do you continue with your economic alignment with Russia? He wanted to pivot to Europe, but he was unable to do so. The practicalities of it were such. I mean, Putin told him, if you want to go to the European Union, feel free. We're not going to stop you, but we're not going to pay for it. Because there's significant economic reforms that have to take place. Russia he was being asked Russia to provide loans. Russia's not going to give you loans so you can pivot away from it. So Putin said, do what you want, pivot all you want. We're not going to stop you. You're a sovereign nation, but we're not going to underwrite it. We're not going to pay for it. And Yanukovych was unable to do this. And so there was a popular uprising that began in 2013, carried over into 2014, very peaceful in nature. People just simply expressing their anger that Yanukovych was unable to fulfill what they viewed was his promise to pivot to the EU. This peaceful demonstration was hijacked by the right ultra-nationalist forces in Ukraine, supported by the United States. These are the right sector, Sloboda, the supporters of Stepan Bandera, that Nazi affiliated thug who murdered hundreds of thousands of people back in the Second World War and afterwards. These people hijacked this peaceful demonstration, turned it into a violent uprising that evicted Viktor Yanukovych from Kiev. They seized power. They took on an anti-Russian agenda, passing legislation which banned the Russian language, banned Russian culture. Then they began attacking the Russians, whom they called orcs, by the way, dehumanizing them. They burned 84 of them to death in Odessa, and then they proceeded to lay the waste to Mariupol, the city on the Sea of Azov, what had been known as the Kharkov's Men's Soccer Club, which was a group of pro-Bandera thugs, transformed themselves into the Azov Regiment, and they began a campaign of genocide against the Russians, compelling the Russian population in the Donbass regions to rise up and resist. Russia supported them in terms of protecting their rights, but Russia told them straight up, you can't declare yourself independent of Ukraine. The Donbass is Ukraine. I mean, everybody says that Russia was seeking to take the Donbass. It's absurd. Russia, from the very beginning in 2014, let it be known that while they will defend the autonomy of these Russians, they're not going to defend independence, that this will be part of Ukraine. That's why Russia promoted the Minsk Accords, Minsk II Accords, the first one in 2014 collapsed, but the second one in 2015 was negotiated with what's called the Normandy format, Germany and France, working with Ukraine, with Russia as an observer, to pass legislation. First of all, there was a ceasefire, to pass legislation that would respect the autonomy, the rights of the Russians to have their own language, culture, etc., but they would be part of Ukraine. The Ukrainian government never ratified this. Why? And we now know. President Poroshenko, who was president at the time, said this was a sham. We only did Minsk II to buy time so that NATO could build up our army so that we could forcefully recapture the Donbass. So Ukraine never had any intention of a peaceful resolution. Ukraine always sought a violent resolution. And indeed, for 8 years, Ukraine carried out vicious shelling of the Donbass areas. Again, the same President Poroshenko infamously gave a speech where he said, our children, meaning Ukrainian children, will go to school and live healthy lives. Your children will be cowering in the basements while we shell them. I mean, so that's what was going on. Russia continuously pressured Ukraine, Germany, and France, and the United States to have Minsk implemented, to bring an end to this conflict. Indeed, in June of 2021, Russian President Putin met with American President Biden in Geneva. And one of the main points that Putin pushed was, look, if you don't want a military conflict in Ukraine, all you have to do is get the Ukrainian government to ratify the Minsk agreement. If you do that, this whole thing's over. It's over. And Biden promised him that he'd do that. Indeed, Blinken later on afterwards said, yes, we will push the Ukrainians to do this. But they were lying, because it was never the policy of the United States to implement Minsk. It was the policy of the United States to use Minsk as a cover to buy time to train Ukrainian forces. We had a permanent military training presence in Ukraine, where every 55 days we trained a battalion of Ukrainian soldiers to NATO standards, which were then sent east to kill Russians. And we bragged about it. We have a slide put out by the public affairs officer of this training unit, bragging about how we're training these guys to go fight Russians in the east. That was what we did. And we did this from 2015 to 2022, 7 years. Every 55 days, a battalion. You count up how many battalions there were. It's a significant number. We built up this army, 60,000, that were poised to attack the Donbass in late February, early March of 2022. This is why Putin launched a special military operation. It was a preemptive attack to make sure that those Ukrainians couldn't attack the Donbass. So to say this is a war of aggression is an absolute misread of history. Would Russia have preferred a peaceful outcome? Yes, they tried for 7 years. They tried to get Minsk II. They begged the United States to implement. They begged the Germans and the French to implement it, but it was a sham. As the President Poroshenko said it was a sham. There was no intention on the part of the West to implement Minsk. Russia had no choice but to do what it did. This way, let's just hypothetically say that all 30 nations of NATO said, that's a great idea. We want to do that. On day one of Ukraine becoming a member, NATO would be at war with Russia on day one. And this is a war that would be existential in nature, a war that would almost immediately result in Russia using nuclear weapons against NATO. So NATO would cease to exist. So what Zelensky's asking NATO to do is to swallow a giant cyanide tablet. He's saying, here, I want you to commit suicide. I want you to invite me in while I'm engaged in a life and death struggle with Russia, so that the moment I join your organization, you're engaged in a life and death struggle with Russia, and Russia is going to immediately obliterate the totality of your cities. It will never happen. This is why not only did the United States come out and say, that's not going to happen. NATO came out and said, no, we're not going to let 10 NATO nations, of course. Yeah, these are the most virulently Russophobic nations: Poland, the Baltic states, the Czech Republic, Romania, and others. But the rest of NATO, the core of NATO, Italy, France, Germany, they all said, nope, that ain't going to happen. So this is just wishful thinking on the part of Zelensky, but it's a clever move. I mean, you have to give Zelensky credit for being able to manipulate NATO. He knew the answer was going to be no. But what happens when people say no? They feel guilty. And so the guilt-ridden NATO is now going to continue to provide a fire hose spigot blasting equipment and money into Ukraine to sustain this conflict. NATO's made it clear, the United States has made it clear that they will continue to provide assistance to Ukraine. But the goal of this, and this is where Zelensky is a horrible leader of his people, because he believes that the goal, or he interprets the goal of NATO to support Ukrainian sovereignty and a Ukrainian victory. I don't think there's anybody in the West that believes Ukraine's going to win this conflict, because NATO isn't willing at the end of the day to go all in. Russia's going all in. They're putting all their chips on the table. NATO's not willing to do that, which means Zelensky is going to be left holding, a pair of threes while Russia's holding a full house. So he's going to lose every time. But NATO's willing to provide Ukraine equipment and money so that Ukraine can kill as many Russians as possible. But this means that ultimately that this will end up in the destruction of the Ukrainian state, literally the destruction of the Ukrainian state. They're not wrong. The fact of the matter is, Russia overextended itself. The special military operation was given sources adequate to the task, the original task of liberating Donbass, but it wasn't resourced to the level necessary to fight the collective West. I think you and I have had this conversation in the past, where I spoke of the decision in May by the United States and NATO to provide tens of billions of dollars worth of military equipment to the Ukrainian military, and to provide strategic depth so that Ukraine could train its forces outside of the reach of Russian attack, to provide intelligence support, communication support, logistics support, to transform the Ukrainian military into a NATO force. This was a game-changing event. And I said right off the bat that Russia doesn't have the resources capable of resolving this, that Russia will have to generate more troops. Russia, over the course of the summer, of course, didn't. Russia continued its tactics of grinding away in the Donetsk region, very successfully, by the way. They were killing tens of thousands of Ukrainians, slowly taking territory. But the end result is that Ukraine was able to build up this massive force of 40, 60,000 well-trained, well-equipped troops. And then they came into Ukraine. A lot of people, lambasted me when I said game. They said, Russia will never allow these forces to be accumulated. Russia will destroy them before they get across the border. Russia will blow up the warehouses and the roads. And, well, Russia didn't. And these 60,000 troops were able to be brought to bear on the battlefield. People mock the Ukrainians. They're not well trained. I've always said the Ukrainians are very well trained, very well motivated, good fighters. And we saw that. They outmaneuvered the Russians. They launched an attack in Kherson that caused Russia to shift strategic reserves out of the Kharkiv region. And then they launched a major attack in the Kharkiv region, picking the precise seam where Russia was at its weakest, in this village which was held by two SWAT teams. How do you expect two SWAT teams to hold off Ukrainian armored divisions? They can't. These SWAT teams fought heroically. They held out. They killed lots of Ukrainians. But in the end, they, like the rest of the Russian military, was compelled to retreat. The Ukrainians humiliated the Russians. They seized all of the Kharkiv area. Russia fell back, claimed to consolidate their defenses. But then the Ukrainians did it again, finding a seam in the Russian defenses in Limon and attacking there, pushing them back, humiliating Putin on the eve of the referendum, claiming all of this is Mother Russia. And Ukraine went, this ain't Mother Russia. We got it back from you. It's a humiliation. Then they're doing it in Kherson. They found the seam in the Russian defenses, pushed through, claimed more territory. Russia's being humiliated. They're not being defeated. They're being humiliated. The Ukrainians are burning through their reserves. This is a Pyrrhic victory. It looks bad for Russia. It is bad for Russia. And here's the thing. Victory is a narcotic. You inject victory into the veins of troops and they will continue to fight like son of guns. Defeat is addictive. You start learning how to lose. Right now, the Russians are sort of learning how to lose, and the Ukrainians are injecting the narcotic of victory into their veins. Russia needs to do something. They need to stabilize this, and then they need to get these 300,000 mobilized troops in. Now, people say, oh, those 300,000, they're not very good. Hey, guys, read history. A guy named Rick Atkinson wrote a wonderful trilogy about the U.S. Army in World War II. And it's amazing, the U.S. Army didn't perform well early on. Everybody remember the Battle of Kasserine Pass, where the Germans wiped out Second Corps. General Fredericks was relieved, and they brought in a guy whose name was George Patton. George Patton came in, he taught them how to win. Well, the Russians just relieved a very inefficient commander of the Western Military District, and they replaced him. They got 300,000 troops coming in. The thing that Atkinson talked about, the transition of the U.S. Army from 1942 to 1945 saw not only the expansion of it, but it became the most professional army of amateurs the world has ever seen. Because the army that we built in World War II was not an army of professional soldiers. It was an army of men, farmers, workers, men who had lives that wanted to get back. All they wanted to do is get back. They did not want to go to war. They didn't volunteer to go to war. They were conscripted to go to war. But what happened when they were conscripted? They got to their wives and they said, honey, I got to go. And the wives cried and their wives released them. These guys went off to fight. And they won because they knew the quickest way home was to win the war and come home. These 300,000 that the Russians just mobilized, that's that kind of people. These aren't the 250,000 cowards that ran away from the fight, fled the country. These are 300,000 workers, men with jobs, men with families, men that are part of the Russian soil, not professional soldiers. They used to serve in the military. They did their duty, and they came home to live their lives. And now they're being called back. And what are these guys doing? They're not chanting USA, USA, USA. They're not wrapping themselves in the flag. They're just looking like, okay, let's get this thing done. We're going to go to work. We're going to get the job done. We're coming home. God help the Ukrainians when these 300,000 troops are let loose on them. They're not fanatics. These are guys who are going to get the job done. They know what the job is. They know what they're signing up for. And they're going to do it. And that's going to be a game changer. The Ukrainians are fighting for their national survival, and it's going to be a tough fight. Don't get me wrong, but NATO's out of equipment. The German parliament just voted overwhelmingly not to provide heavy equipment to NATO. The United States passed a $12 billion arms allocation, but it's not weaponry that's going to give it to them now. We don't have anything left to give them, but we're going to have to build it. It's not going to be ready to be given to the Ukrainians until the end of 2023, early 2024. This is the reality. The Russians up by the hand, everybody's like, these reserves, they're going to have old equipment. And yet they're looking at the trains coming and going, that's brand new stuff. Yeah, Russia since 2016 has been building a lot of equipment for the reserve forces. And these reserves are going to fall in on brand new equipment. They're going to be motivated to get the job done. And I think we're going to see both a qualitative and quantitative alteration of the battlefield in the months to come. But let's deal with the here and now. It's embarrassing for Russia. You know, the 150th Motorized Rifle Division, a storied unit, recently remobilized. It's a unit that captured Berlin. They were mobilized and reconstituted in 2017. These guys, it's an expanded division with 4 regiments. These guys are good, modern equipment, everything. They lost their battle flag. No unit loses its battle flag. No unit loses its battle flag. Only a unit that is totally given up. You burn your battle flag. That's what happened to the 4th Marine Regiment in Corregidor when they were told to surrender. First thing they did is they fought to the death. There was hardly anybody left alive. And the last orders given by the Marine regimental commander was burn the colors. Our colors will never fall into the hands of the enemy. That's what a unit with pride does. The 150th gave up. Well, we just talked about doom and despair. My book, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika, Arms Control and the End of the Soviet Union, I think is a book about a time when we had similar levels of despair in the 1980s, where nuclear war was looming. And yet the United States and the Soviet Union found a way to come together, to get rid of the nuclear weapons that threatened. That was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. This book is a history of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, told through the experiences of me. I was one of the first inspectors on the ground. I played an important role in implementing a critical aspect of this treaty. So it's an interesting story from that standpoint, a very human story, not only about the inspectors, but about the Russians. This is a book that will teach everybody who reads it about the Russian people, the Russian psyche, about perestroika, what happened, why it failed, from the Russian perspective. It's also a book that provides a template of hope. When people take a look today and say, how in God's name are the United States and the Russians ever going to come together and find a way out of where we are? This book shows you that there was a time when we did just that. This Camelot-like moment where everything came together. We worked together to get rid of nuclear weapons. We worked together for the mutual benefit. And we can do it again. So if you read this book, not only will you learn a lot about the history of arms control, but you'll also learn, as George Santayana once said, those who fail to learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat it. But the implication there is that history failed. Let's call it those who fail to learn about the successes of history are condemned never to repeat it. You read this book, you'll learn about one of the greatest successes in American history. Get on Clarity Press's website. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on Barnes and Nobles. But the best way to get it is to go to your local bookstore and ask the bookseller not only to stock the book, but here's a hint. Why don't you have a book signing event where yours truly will come in, talk about the book, you can buy the book there, and it would be a wonderful deal. So there's lots of options there. Resources necessary to finish the job. Is NATO willing to commit whatever resources are necessary to prevent Russia? And the answer is no. We already know that because NATO says we're not getting involved. That means all they could do is continue to supply more weapons. To give you an example of how many more weapons can the USA provide, Congress just passed a $12 billion supplemental budget for the Ukrainian military that includes provision of 18 of these HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems. But they're not being delivered now. They're not being delivered next year. They won't be delivered till 2024. Why? We don't have any more to give. We already gave them all the extra ones we had. We have no more extra. In order to give them more HIMARS, we have to take them away from frontline combat units for the United States, and we're not willing to do that. So we have to build them new, brand new. It takes time to build them. The defense industry doesn't just spit them out. You have to order them up. You have to be built by various vendors all around the country. You have to come in. And unless you're willing to pay more for overtime and increase staff, increase production space, you're only going to get them through the very narrow production window that's existed in the past. We didn't have to worry about building large numbers quickly because we would procure them over time. Ukraine needs them now. They're not going to get them for at least another year and a half. That's the same thing with Germany. Germany has no more weapons to give Ukraine. Germany can talk all they want about giving them weapons, giving them money. There are no more weapons to give. Canada, nothing. Netherlands, nothing. The Brits, they got nothing. They've given it all away. If they give anything more away, it comes from their active duty forces. And at this time when NATO's panicking about the potential of Russia, continuing the offensive once it takes over Ukraine into NATO, is NATO really going to strip itself naked to help Ukraine? Ukrainians have lost the war. That's just straight up. Ukrainian army was defeated sometime in June and July when the last of their Soviet-era equipment that they started this conflict with was destroyed by the Russians. Since then, they've continued to fight only because NATO has poured in tens of billions of dollars of equipment to reconstitute this military. And the person's right. Germany voted. They went to the parliament. The parliament voted. I think it was 100 and something to 400 and something. Overwhelming amount of German parliamentarians said, no more weapons to Ukraine. And that's going to happen now. Now, for a couple of reasons. One, Ukraine has showed itself to be incapable of victory. Wait a minute, Scott, didn't they just take Kharkov? Wait and see how long they hold Kharkov. I think the Russians are going to own it in a couple of days. Or not days, maybe weeks. But, no, Ukraine has squandered what NATO gave it. They threw it away in politically motivated offenses that's cost the Ukrainians tens of thousands of lives, and all of the equipment that NATO